Hello and welcome back to this downplayed dualistic crusade. In this video I'm going to review Indicator's fifth in their Columbia Noir box set series, and this time it is devoted to a single star. It is revolving around the later films of Humphrey Bogart, really going from the late 40s into the 1950s, in the latter stages of his career at the end of his Warner contract days, and when he tried to become an independent producer or star producer with his Santana Pictures Corporation. This is a period of Bogart's career that is less discussed. It does not feature a lot of the more iconic films. He wound up doing more iconic films in his later career, but outside of his Warner days, but these would sort of be around all these other really interesting little gems that often get overlooked and don't get discussed outside of diehard fan circles. But for fans of Bogie, as everyone should be, there's never a bad performance or a time where he doesn't appear on screen and immediately have such an incredible legendary screen presence. So even in these lesser films or films that frankly most people are not going to be aware of or probably haven't seen, there is still always something to draw the Bogart fan there, and they always have at least some intelligence behind them. And these independent production films under his Santana banner, they had a deal at Columbia, so these were all made at Columbia for certain budgets, and they were trying to sort of break new ground, but they were also, held back by the budgets they had and being at Columbia and having to deal with Harry Cohn, and also Bogart's friend Mark Hellinger was supposed to basically be the sort of point man and was already himself a great producer, but unfortunately he died, and that left a big sort of hole to fill in in this new company venture of Bogart's, of course named after his beloved yacht, the Santana. So while these films are, I think most people would say that they are sort of a mixed bag. Your mileage may vary which ones you may enjoy more. You can't deny that they did have the best of intentions behind them. They did have a lot of interesting ideas, and Bogart wound up working with and requesting a lot of personnel that were either up and coming, like Nicholas Ray, or people that he had really done well with in the past, or sort of repaying favors, like tapping John Cromwell to direct the first film in the set, which is Dead Reckoning. So there's a whole group of really solid and interesting names in the cast and crew of these films. And Bogart was one of the stars who was really trying to go for that star producer title, as this was the point at which the studios really started to lose their ironclad grip on things. This is, of course, coming after, or right just about the time as the Paramount decree and the studios losing their theaters and the whole system starting to change, and of course right after the immediate post-war period where the movies had their greatest success, and then immediately that started going away, and we were also smack dab in the middle of what is now known as the golden age of noir, when of course back in the day these were just crime and detective stories. Nobody thought about it as a genre. So these films all do fit within the confines of what is typically considered a film noir, but they also sort of vary. They're not just straight-ahead crime stories or crime thrillers. They also deal, again, with the immediacy of the post-war period. So these are characters who are sometimes returning servicemen, or they have their war background, and it's a couple years later, and the war will get referenced in various ways. So it's also fascinating to look at films from 1947, 1948, a couple years after the war, where that malaise had still, it had not dissipated. It was still there, and it was just sort of getting buried by everyday life. Now, as I said, this set contains 6 films, and interestingly, one of them does not star Humphrey Bogart. So if you're coming into this set and you think it's a Bogart set, then you get to this film, which is The Family Secret. You may be a bit confused as to why it's included here, but that is because it is one of the only Santana Productions that does not star Bogart. So Bogart has his essentially producer credit, and had also helped in seeking out the property to develop as a film, but wound up not starring in it himself. This is a very rare title, and it's a film that I had not gotten to see before this point. I'd read about, but most of the books on Bogart, and anytime, even in biographies, they're talking about the Santana Corporation and these films that Bogart was trying to do and trying to be an independent producer. They very rarely, if ever, mention the one or two other films that the company produced as sort of trying to, not necessarily as programmers, but to try and have some other product out there to also have a good story, and really to keep the company afloat and to fulfill their contracts. But these one or two other films, because they don't star Bogart and they are kind of obscure and they sort of came and went very quickly, they don't get mentioned or discussed. So they are fascinating to look at, and really look at within the context of what Bogart's company was trying to do. And again, you can get the sort of great ideas behind them. Unfortunately, because this is a noir set, they were not going to include the only other Santana film, which is ironically a comedy of sorts, which is kind of bizarre to think of, but it's at least amazing to get this particular film, The Family Secret, which it does very much qualify as a noir. It has very noir-esque moments for sure, and the storyline is surprisingly very dark. But it's really interesting to include here, and I think it's really only because Indicator was doing this set that this film is included, because it is very obscure. It only had an MOD DVD release from Sony a couple years ago, and that's been it. It is a film that has been very hard to track down, and I've just meant to see it but have never gotten to. So that's the really nice. I mean, the set is, of course, Indicators, of course, is loaded with bonuses, but the real bonus attraction here is you do get one of the only Santana-produced films that does not star Bogart, and it is a very rare and obscure film. So that's a nice additional embellishment to encourage. Of course, all Bogart fans are already going to buy this because you should, and but the inclusion, I think, of this film really shows you the depths of how much this label really tries to not just put love and care into these releases, but also to really give a sense of the historical context. They always do that with their extras, even if it's something only tangentially related due to like the director having a short or something from around the same time period. But to include really rare and obscure films like this that obviously doesn't have Bogart as the star. When the set was announced, that was the most striking aspect for me. Not only was it some of the films that I really love and stick up for, and seemingly nobody's ever heard of them outside of other Bogart fans, but they were including this film, The Family Secret. So that was the cherry on top of the sundae, essentially, that I can now finally see this obscure other Santana film. So to jump into the set, I'll talk about each of the films, then talk about the transfer and special features for each disc in turn. As usual, because this is Indicator, this set is absolutely stuffed with extras. Each film has a brand new audio commentary from some really great commentators. Each one has a different one. Then each film also has a number of notable extras, with the real interesting bit, as Indicator has been doing with a lot of their noir sets so far. They have gone and actually included a lot of the World War II documentaries and propaganda pieces that were worked on by a lot of the directors and writers and producers who were obviously in the motion pictures division during the war. And of course, it's a wonderful historical artifact to see what they were doing in the war, see how that maybe translated somewhat into their immediate post-war films, and it's something that doesn't get gone into all that much. And in particular, one of the most important World War II documentaries from the propaganda pieces that were done is included in this set, and almost all of these are brand new transfers for these various shorts, which is something that they didn't have to do in terms of Indicator. They didn't have to do that. They could have probably just sourced some old standard def version or something, but I was amazed that these were brand new transfers and they were specifically commissioned for this set. This is something that they have done in the past on their previous Noir boxes to varying degrees. So I think it's a fascinating historical documentation of the work that these people were doing during the war that, again, does not really often get discussed outside of being a footnote in somebody's filmography. So first up is the aforementioned 1947 film Dead Reckoning. Now, for those new to this set, this will probably be the most familiar of these films in that it feels very much patterned after iconic Bogart hits from before this point. Bogie is essentially playing he's not a private eye, but he basically goes through it as if he were a private eye, and he's playing a GI ex-serviceman who's looking for his friend who ran off as soon as he was going to receive the Congressional Medal of Honor, as if he didn't want to get noticed, and of course has a sordid back history and enlisted under an assumed name. Then the Bogart character has to essentially unravel the mystery from there and go to his hometown and sort of deal with the local underworld there, and gets into all kinds of sordid messes. And it does seem to have quite a deal of the Hawks version of The Big Sleep from the year before. Of course, you have the same star, but the script as we have it in the film does take a number of cues from not only Bogart's performance as Marlowe in The Big Sleep, but also an occasional dash of his Sam Spade from The Maltese Falcon. So again, that's why I think this film of the six will feel the most familiar to people. It co-stars Elizabeth Scott. This was one of her early film roles, and it does seem as if they did sort of sell the picture as trying to compete with or do their own version of trying to sell Elizabeth Scott as a Lauren Bacall type, right down to even giving her a sort of name moniker in the posters and promotional campaigns. Unfortunately, the film is the script never quite gets off the ground. That was something they struggled with while making the film. Again, Bogart had a great relationship with John Cromwell, going all the way back to when Bogart was a young actor on the stage on Broadway, and Cromwell cast him when he was more of an unknown, and so Bogart was well known for being extremely loyal to people who had helped him, or being helpful to young actors, and always having a long memory of people who had been loyal to him in the past. So he had director approval on this, since it was essentially doing it for Columbia as a sort of loan out. And there is a sense of, even if the film ultimately doesn't quite add up exactly, there is a sort of feeling of, it feels a little bit freer, because this is getting outside of Warner Brothers, and of course Bogart and Jack Warner were famously did not see eye to eye, and Bogart had long been the sort of workhorse and the guy who was made to do anything Warner Brothers wanted. And when he became a big star, he finally started having clout to say no and to fight back a little bit. And when he started doing films outside of Warner Brothers, I think he could start to see what it was like outside of his contract, which was going to be up sooner rather than later. And I think in this film, what really makes it work is that different sort of energy, and we have the Bogart who is much more world weary. Again, there is, I would say, mostly a great deal of his Philip Marlowe in this performance, in this particular film, because it seems very much patterned on trying to do another version of The Big Sleep. It's also hard to get around the fact that it does seem pretty much designed originally to have been a vehicle to co-star Rita Hayworth, this coming after her iconic turn in Gilda. And of course, Columbia and Harry Cohn were eager to try and put her in as many similar vehicles as possible, since she became such a great star. So there are a number of films, particularly the film Affair in Trinidad, which reteamed her with Glenn Ford, which Indicator did in their box 2 of their Noir set, which is pretty much just trying to redo Gilda. They did that a number of times, and it seems this film was originally designed that way, but for various reasons, they wound up not using Rita Hayworth. She did other films and didn't do this one. And after some time, they wound up going with Elizabeth Scott. Most people who see this film want to criticize her performance, but I've never had a problem with it because the character is supposed to be mysterious, and you don't quite know if she is the femme fatale, and there's a mystery to be unraveled. So I've never quite minded that. And there's also a great deal of darkness in the story. It had, of course, The Big Sleep had that as well, but it also had a greater deal of humor. This film has humor, but it's much more spread out. And when the violent bits happen, they do have a certain degree of intensity. Bogart gets knocked out multiple times. He gets roughed up. He gets drugged, and then in the most vicious sequence, he's beaten to a bloody pulp by the big hulking henchman, and who basically then decides to play tap dance on Bogart's prone form on the floor, and most amusingly to his particular favorite piece of music as he's doing it to sort of encourage him on further. However, I will say the absolute standout of the film and the best scene, and of course he pops up once or twice more, so there's really like 3 or 4 scenes, but is actually the part played by the great actor Wallace Ford, who at this point had become one of the screen's great character actors. And it's a particular scene where he plays a retired safecracker, essentially, and the main characters basically go to his house and they're just trying to ask his advice. And just this scene of it got romantic overtones as well. So the sort of, oh, what do we do for a date? Oh, well, let's go talk to this ex-safecracker to figure out how to get into the mobster's safe and how we can convince him to crack it. And then, you get the great bit of when he asks what safe it is, and they say they don't know. He pulls out a giant book and asks them to flip through it like it's like they're looking at a rap sheet or a mugshot book for safes, and then they're able to identify. And he's like, "Oh, that's a 10-minute job." And of course, he hears it's for the local mobster and immediately shuts up. But it's just a fascinating little scene. And then to talk about the post-war aspect, when they go in, he's brandishing all of these trinkets and items that his son has brought back from the war. So he's got a sword or two, he's got a bunch of guns and rifles, and then even a couple of grenades and things, just nonchalantly as you do. And of course this will play into the plot at the climax of the film, but it's a particularly fascinating scene. It's a shame the film couldn't be up to that level of creativity throughout, but I still think it's a really interesting noir from this time period, and I think it's one of the strongest in terms of, if you wanted a more traditional Bogart type experience, if you're used to the Warner films, and particularly if you're a big fan of the sort of mixture of humor and world weariness with a wry sense of self-awareness that Bogart displays so beautifully in The Big Sleep. I think that Dead Reckoning is perfect because it's very much a continuation of that with a different sort of flavor. It's not perfect, but I really admire these films even when they do have issues that don't derail the film. But even when they're flawed, I think they're so fascinating that this is Bogart getting to get away from Warner Brothers. Even if it doesn't quite work, he's trying some different things. And in this film, it is sort of putting him on the path to eventually becoming an independent producer shortly thereafter. Now, to talk about the transfer and the supplements of the disc itself, this is, like most of the discs here, it is from Sony's HD Master, which was released to DVD a number of years ago. So this is pretty much just an HD upgrade of what we saw on that DVD. Sony was one of the first studios to really jump on board with making high-definition masters and protection elements very early on. So if you look at the back of most of their DVDs, you will notice most of them will have some remastered in high-definition indicator on it. That means it is an HD master they made. Sometimes they would update them a little bit, But basically, it is a preservation master, so this is not a full frame-by-frame restoration. I will say I think it does look much improved over that old DVD, which is definitely getting on up there in age. And for their black and white classic titles, the HD upgrades that have come out on Blu-ray so far of these, even if they're not brand new 2K or 4K scans and not full restorations, I do think the HD upgrades are a significant improvement because you obviously have less compression. You're able to display the master better. It is in 1080p over 480p. And this one I have owned on DVD, and I did think this was a significant improvement, even though it is just basically a bump up to 1080p. So of course this means this isn't a brand new frame-by-frame restoration. So of course that means there's going to be some printed in and baked in damage from the source itself. Now that turns up primarily in some specs, one or two minor bits of frame wobble, and the occasional hair or two poking in on the edges of the frame. But the big one is there are some bits of damage where there are a number of lines present. There are some scratches, obviously, but they are very minor. But the lines that are visible, you will notice it once or twice. They are small, but definitely there, and that's fine. That's obviously going to be part of a source when it comes up. But the big one is when the Bogart character goes into the nightclub for the first time at about 20 minutes into the film, and you will notice for at least a solid minute or two there are several very prominent lines through the image. That was the exact same way on the DVD. It is part of Sony's HD source. It is the most notable bit of damage in any of these, and thankfully it only lasts for a minute or two, and they sort of vary, so it's not like it's just giant scratch marks across, but you will definitely notice them. They have been part of the film source on all the major video releases, and until this gets a brand new frame-by-frame restoration, they will be part of it. And unfortunately, due to this being one of the more obscure, lesser discussed Bogart titles, that doesn't have the greatest reputation in the world, that's probably not going to happen anytime soon. So this presentation of Sony's HD Master is without question the best the film has ever looked on home video, and I do think it is a distinct improvement over the old DVD. But it's the same master. It is a little dark in the opening, I think, but that is part of the source and the setting of the flashback framework. There you will notice one or two bits of damage as well as the feature runs, but they are thankfully very minor. The big one is those big lines in the nightclub sequence. So it is, again, pretty much what we got on DVD, but now bumped up to 1080p and beautifully encoded by indicator. In terms of the audio, it is the same source as the DVD. It is the original mono. It is losslessly encoded as PCM, which Indicator is really good about doing. And I do think it actually sounds a little better than the DVD, even though it is the same source, simply due to the fact that you don't have the same amount of compression as you do on the lossy DVD track from years and years ago. Now, it sounds pretty good for what it is, but I've only ever seen this film on the DVD before, so I've never owned or seen the previous video editions of any of these films going before DVD, and they really didn't have very many. You have to go a long ways back to the VHS days, and some got a Laserdisc release, but Columbia Classics on LD, particularly of 30s and 40s films, never really got deluxe treatment and usually had analog soundtracks, so I don't foresee those being all that great, but you never know. Sometimes they turn out to be really good transfers from back then, but they are quite rare, and again, I've just never seen any of those. I did write an article on them in preparation for this box set, so I will link to that in the description below if you're interested, of course. So to talk about the actual packaging and then the disc extras itself, Indicator, as usual for their box sets, has gone with this beautiful slim case with this beautiful rendering of original poster art. All of their Noir sets have this. They always choose a perfect original poster and then beautifully duplicated on these. These are, they're not actual cases. They are this sort of I don't know what you call it, cardstock material, but it has a very fine quality to it, but you do always want to be careful because the edges sort of stick out, and you don't want to drop one of these and ding the corners, and also you got to be careful sliding it in and out of the box. But the quality has a wonderful premium feel to it, and the printing and especially how the color comes across is really well done. To open it up, you also, on all of these, get some other form of original imagery. This time they're using another of the film's posters, and then the disc art has the same image, promotional still, that is used for the main key image. And again, it is beautifully chosen and laid out to perfectly match the color of the actual sort of off-white material. So the whole thing has a beautiful, very pleasing look to the eye. So as usual, Indicator has a wonderful, really stacked little extras package for this film. So it mentions this is Sony's HD remaster with the original mono audio. The brand new audio commentary is with Alan K. Rody, who does great commentaries and has written a number of really essential film biographies. He talks primarily about Elizabeth Scott and this this film's place in her career. I think he mentioned that he is actually working on a book about Scott, a new biography, which would be really fascinating to read. He does talk about Bogart as well, this film's place in his career, the sort of situation with Hollywood at the time in the late 1940s, the sort of problems they had in trying to script the film with the various writers and develop it, making this film at Columbia instead of Warner Brothers outside of Bogie's contract. Also, John Cromwell being selected as director and him sort of feeling a little bit like a fish out of water because this was sort of out of his usual forte, and he was known as being more of an actor's director. So it's a great commentary track. Indicator always gets wonderful tracks out of people because it's a difficult art to do, and so I always really appreciate the fact that they go to a variety of people and get them to contribute to different films, and not just the famous ones but the more obscure ones as well, because again, every film in the set has a brand new audio commentary and all of them are worth your time. Then in terms of the other extras, we have a new featurette by Tony Raines called A Pretty Good Shot. It runs about 17 minutes, and it's an appreciation about this film, and it's wonderful getting people to actually talk in positive terms about the lesser regarded or lesser discussed Bogart vehicles, because they are fascinating. They are filled with great ideas, even if, like this film, it doesn't quite exactly work. It's a film that, as with all of these, I think they open up more over time, and so if you come back to it, it definitely grows on you much more than the first impression might indicate. Then moving into the vintage World War II pieces, we have a 16-minute short from 1945 entitled Watchtower Over Tomorrow. This was actually directed by John Cromwell and is about the formation of the United Nations, essentially. And it's a fascinating little artifact of its time because it's trying to explain why the UN was formed, but it's also chock full of many famous faces in terms of various character actors, and there is a sort of unseen narrator. It's rather interesting how it's done, so it is sort of amusing in a sort of time capsule type way. And it is well put together. Unfortunately, because the narrator does most of the work, a lot of famous faces pop up, and you just see them doing something, but obviously it's been dubbed over by this narrator. But it's got a lot of people. It's even got Lionel Stander in there. It's got the wonderful George Zucco and even Martin Kolzek, so it's got something for Universal horror fans. But it's a fascinating little artifact of its time, and again, something I had mentioned before, Indicator trying to give the history of what these people were doing during the war with these propaganda films that just frequently get overlooked and not discussed. And in this set in particular, there is pretty much a World War II piece on most every disc. Then we close out with the image gallery of promotional and publicity material. And but a lot of people do image galleries, but when Indicator does something, again, you get the attention to detail. Their photo galleries, particularly on this set, are really exceptional. They are all rather substantial, and they also have nothing but high-res, perfectly mastered pictures. They are not using any sort of half-assed low-res materials, and they are laid out in a way on all of these galleries to have set stills, promotional stills, publicity stills, and then go into the advertising materials. And they give you a variety of posters and lobby cards for the film, so you can see how the promotion was done and developed over the different posters of the campaign. But then they also include, where possible, a lot of the foreign posters. And that's something that I really enjoy studying, seeing how a film was sold in other countries, particularly in the golden age of Hollywood during the studio system. And a lot of them have beautifully striking arts that are just as good, if not sometimes even better, than their U.S. counterparts. So to actually get that in an image gallery, in addition to the U.S. posters, is really something, and it definitely shows you that this is a label doing releases for cinephiles. So again, if Indicator's going to do something, they're not going to half-ass it. So these are some of the best image galleries I've ever seen on a disc, and they are all pretty substantial, usually having anywhere between 20 and sometimes up to 50 or more stills and posters included. And of course, you can also see the poster choice they would eventually use for the cover. Then it goes on to say that they did new and improved English subtitles for the deaf and hard of hearing. That means, as usual, Indicator had to actually sit there and make sure the subtitles worked and fix any typos and rewrite it themselves to improve it, which takes a lot of time and a lot of patience. And that's something that few, if any, labels do, especially today. So that is another thing that really sets Indicator apart, and something that, while it's not something I personally need to use, I think it is a very commendable thing, and so I like highlighting it when I can, because when they put that on here, that's why they're putting it on here, and that's something that a lot of people are in need of, and unfortunately it's hard to find out what releases have good subtitles, and half the time the subtitles are just the same ones copied over from the studio source that may have baked in issues. And then it also includes that fact that this is the film's premiere on Blu-ray in the UK. Some of these films have gotten released already in terms of other countries like Germany and Australia. Again, that's part of the article I wrote, so if you're curious about some of the other Blu-ray releases, you can check out the piece I did on those. So all in all, while Dead Reckoning is maybe a bit more formulaic, it definitely has a lot of the noir touchstones. I don't know if all of them were necessarily essential. It does have a flashback structure with bookends that maybe it didn't necessarily need, but it is a film that has a different flavor from Bogart's Warner Brothers vehicles, and it has a sort of emerging darkness that will continue in the films in this set. And it's a film I've enjoyed coming back to, so it's definitely one that the first time I saw it, I thought it was simply okay or passable with some interesting bits, but it's definitely grown on me over the years, so don't let that first impression put you off from coming back to it. And it was a treat to actually get to see it in HD, even if it is the same old Sony HD master. Next is 1949's Knock on Any Door, which is under the Santana banner and was directed by the great Nicholas Ray. This is the film that sort of brought Bogart and Ray together and led to them eventually making the masterpiece In a Lonely Place shortly thereafter. Ray, of course, was famed for his sort of breakout directorial feature, They Live by Night, which is still an incredible film, and you can definitely get that same sort of energy carrying over into this film, which was based on a very popular novel that proved rather tricky to adapt, since it dealt with a lot of things the production code wouldn't really allow for. So if you do compare it to the novel, which I haven't read, but the commentary goes into a great amount of detail about the differences, it is definitely toned down from the source novel, and essentially is telling the tale of what happens to a youth who grows up in essentially the slums, and how essentially the deck is sort of stacked against him in life, and how it draws him further into essentially a life of crime and larceny and darkness. And can he escape from that? Bogart plays a lawyer who actually has a background of a very similar background, who managed to pull himself up by his bootstraps and at least develop a successful legal career, and winds up sort of becoming a inadvertent father figure to this character at key intervals in his life. And it takes place over an extended period of time, with a interesting sort of flashback structure, because the opening of the film deals with a robbery gone wrong and a policeman is killed, and then they literally do the round up the usual suspects bit, and our lead character, played by John Derek, is essentially the prime suspect, and he's essentially dragged in and calls the only person he really can talk to, which is the Bogart character, who has to put up with a lot of flack, but he decides to defend this boy, and it goes into being a courtroom film. But in the process of Bogart putting up the defense, we get these extended flashbacks of the character Nick Romano's life and his back history. So it's not a conventionally told film in terms of it being a narrative from A to Z. So there is a flashback structure giving it that sort of noir-esque feel even more, but it is sort of disjointed because it's doing that over a span of time and is broken up by the courtroom sequences. However, it does have a great sense of realism, and I think that is entirely down to Nick Ray, and if you've ever seen a Nicholas Ray film, you know what they're like. You know the intensity that he can give to the actors' performances, along with a sense of realism. Even though this is obviously using a lot of sets, it does feel much more vivid and much more sort of ripped from the streets as intended. And of course, they were basing it on a very popular novel that had done the same thing, but had gone much further, which they couldn't do under the production code. So the Bogart character was sort of invented and beefed up, and it sort of changes the focus a little bit, but it's still telling the same general story idea. It is also a really excellent courtroom drama in terms of the effectiveness of the court scenes, and it's not just people standing in a courtroom. It's apparently going on during a heat wave because they're all sweating like mad and always wiping their faces, and it builds to some really impressive sort of courtroom dueling sequences between Bogart and the always great George Macready, who has a really great showy part, particularly at the end of the trial. John Derek is actually quite excellent in the role. He usually gets a lot of flack for not being quote-unquote a great actor or being very committed to his career, but this is probably his best on-screen performance, as the role is pretty much, I think, tailor-made for him. And it definitely is a film where the character is going on a continual downward spiral, and it does go to some quite dark places, and it's surprising what they were able to get past the production code, but it is definitely tamed down from the original novel significantly, which the commentary goes into a great detail on, which is very helpful. So, but this is also the film where a very iconic bit of dialogue comes from, where the Nick Romano character repeats many times his sort of his life's motto is to live fast, die young, and leave a good-looking corpse, which has entered the lexicon as part of pop culture. So it's something that seeped into the public consciousness and has had a life far greater than the film or the original novel. So if you ever wondered where that phrase came from, it actually comes from this, and that alone tells you the sort of intensity factor that this film has, and the sort of depths of darkness that the Nick Romano character finds himself in, some by the seemingly the forces of the world and society, but also a great deal due to his own choices and, shall we say, not very good ones. So it is a film not afraid to go to darker places, and it does build to a rather impressive, showy a bit courtroom climax where it's like Bogart's been saving up for this. He gets to have a wonderful, really fantastic summation speech that really gets across the theme of the film, and of course does get to name drop the title, but it's a really impressive final summation if you're into courtroom films, and Bogart is able to do it with such energy that it really has great conviction behind it. And again, I think it's a film really made and made truly effective by the lead performances, particularly of Bogart, and by being directed by Nicholas Ray. I mean, that just goes without saying. If it had been directed by anybody else, even with the same script, particularly a I hate to say it, but less talented, more studio director or even a journeyman director, it would not have had the same intensity. It wouldn't have had the greater degree of passionate performances and relatable qualities of the younger characters, which is something that Ray is renowned for, of course, with films like They Live by Night and Rebel Without a Cause, especially. You have echoes of that even here already in 1949. It would not have been the same film. So even if people might have issues with it being heavily watered down and changed and reworked from the original novel, it's understandable to get through the production code. And I do think the screenwriters did an interesting and very good job at replicating a lot of what happens in the novel. Again, the structure is a bit different. It is a bit unconventional, but that also keeps you interested in the film because it's not telling you a conventional, it's not telling the story in a conventional narrative way exactly. And again, the ending does pack a nice punch to it, and it does build to that quite nicely. And it is a film that's not afraid to take risks. Again, a signifier that it is a Santana production. Originally, Mark Hellinger was going to produce this. He was a great friend of Bogart's and had done many hard-hitting, darker films. And unfortunately, he died too young. And so this film was just essentially continued on. So it's interesting to think what might have been had Hellinger lived longer and wound up producing this film, if it would have been any different. But I think it has enough of that same spirit carrying into it. And it is important that this was a Santana production. Bogart was a very literate man and did not, and of course, a lifelong chess player, and people did not know this about him. They just had the tough guy image in their heads. So every project that Santana did, whether Bogart started in it or not, usually had some sort of literary background or stage background. And even if it wound up not working or being a giant hit, you could always see the great ideas behind it. And I think that was very important to Bogart, that all the projects that he did as an independent had to have great thought and intelligence behind them in order to make them worthwhile, as any intelligent person would want to do. And I think you get that front and center with Knock on Any Door, which is still a remarkable film and one of the best films in the set. And of course, it directed by the great legendary Nicholas Ray, with that level of intensity that he brought to almost everything he ever did. Now, this is another of Sony's HD remasters, so this will be pretty much exactly the same as what turned up on the DVD release. It is not a new scan and is not a full frame-by-frame restoration, so it does have some baked-in issues. But again, as with Dead Reckoning, I do think the bump to 1080p on this indicator release is by far and large a distinct improvement over the appearance on DVD, even though it is the same master. So I do think it has a very healthy looking appearance, but of course it is not perfect because it has some baked in issues, as it has not been restored frame by frame. I do really hope this film gets a new scan. If Sony were to do a new 4K remaster and scan and restoration on any of the other films in this set besides The Harder They Fall, which they did, I think this would be the next one, as it is a real standout. It has great importance, and it was shot by the great Burnett Guffey, who does a really wonderful job with Nicholas Ray at creating a sort of enhanced realism, if you want to use a sort of term like that. Even though it's studio sets, the photography really heightens the drama, and there's a great usage of shadow, and there's also it definitely has a striking visual appearance to it, and I think that could really benefit from a new 4K scan and frame-by-frame restoration. But since that hasn't happened yet, I do think this is the best the film has ever looked on home video, but it does have some baked-in issues. There is a bit of frame wobble here and there. There are some visible hairs that poke in. There's especially a few in part of the courtroom sequence. And there are a few other hairs scattered throughout, and again, most people probably aren't going to notice them because they are rather small, but there are couple slightly bigger ones, and some bits of dirt and the occasional scratch or speck or two, but those are very minor. I think that the biggest thing I noticed, though, in this particular transfer, looking at it this time, and it's much more visible in HD as it was on the old DVDs. There is quite a bit of frame wobble on and off here and there. It's never bad, but you will notice it occasionally happen. That a little bit of wobble is something you'll see in a lot of things like this. It's going to be common, just as you get with scratches and specks and dirt and the occasional hair or two poking in on the sides or bottom of the frame. But on this particular transfer, I did notice a couple instances of frame wobble and a couple hairs here and there. So I think those are the only major issues of what's baked in to this older HD master. But it is a really good master for being older, and again, Sony was one of the first studios to really make this a concentrated effort to make preservation masters in HD and at least do them well, so that way they had something to rely on and they could eventually release them on Blu-ray or license them out for Blu-ray releases. So just because it's an older Sony HD master does not mean it's bad or deficient because it's not a 2K scan or a 4K scan with a modern restoration. So these Sony masters do really hold up, and I do think it is a distinct improvement over the DVD in all areas because, again, you were getting 1080p with a beautiful encoding from indicator, and it's not a very getting on up there in years DVD from the early 2000s. Now, the audio is, once again, the original mono mix. It is PCM, so it is fully lossless, and it sounds pretty similar to what I remember the DVD sounding like. Again, it's Sony's HD master, so it should be the same audio source, but this time fully lossless. So it does sound good for what it is. I didn't notice any major issues or anything, but again, it is still the Sony HD master and its audio track. Now, to talk about the packaging, again, it's in this beautiful slimline cardstock case. Beautiful original US poster artwork, beautifully rendered. The color really pops off of this slightly, I guess, almost sort of light cream colored background. Lovely spine. I always love how Indicator maintains the original tagline on the back of these. Then the interior has an alternate US poster, and then the disc with the label having the same image as the underlying image, which is really beautifully rendered and very much is attention grabbing. This from the Bogie's final courtroom summation speech. Now, to go into the once again stuffed supplemental features on this disc, it's Sony's HD remaster with the original mono audio. The new audio commentary recorded for this release is with Pamela Hutchinson. It's a really great track where she goes into not just scene and character analysis, but talking about the actors and the personnel, Nicholas Ray, Bogart, Santana Productions. Also, she most especially, and the most important part, I think, is how the film differs very greatly from the novel. So she talks a bit about how the novel was much darker and how it was a bestseller and viewed as slightly salacious at the time, I guess you would say, and all the things that the screenwriters really struggled with in trying to adapt it and get it past the production code and make it approvable, and also how they were able to fit a character in for Bogarts to play and sort of build that up a bit with the Nick Romano character, and then also dealing with the structure of creating the flashbacks inside the courtroom sequences. So it's a really great track. She goes into a lot of detail, and it has a nice conversational tone to it as well. So again, as always, when Indicator commissions a commentary, I really appreciate it for films like this, that you would think this film already had a commentary, but it never has really before, and this is a film that definitely needs one. It is definitely of absolute merit, so a good commentary like this is really welcome. Then we have a brand new featurette featuring critic and film programmer Jeff Andrew, entitled Nobody Knows How Anybody Feels, which is a great line from the film. It runs 20 minutes, created for this release, and it's a nice appreciation of this film with some different perspectives, but again, this film is quite impressive, so getting a whole 20-minute featurette in addition to a great informative commentary is really nice, because this is one of those films that when you see it, and again, because it was directed by Nicholas Ray. They definitely have staying power. All films Ray directed pretty much, and so this is the type of film that as soon as you finish watching it, you want to go on the other parts of the disc and look at some extras because you want more context. Because again, it stays with you. It has staying power. It has an impact, and you can't just immediately switch off and go watch something else or do something else. You've got to process what you've just sat through, and again, especially after the ending, which has a nice punch to it. Then next we get another of the World War II vintage propaganda documentaries. This one is very much a time capsule and has that sort of amusing quality of it being presented in a certain way. It's entitled Tuesday in November from 1945, running about 17 minutes, and it's about the democratic process in America and essentially in a small town, how various people volunteer to run the poll locations and collect the ballots, and how everyone participates and everyone has a vote, and how without the participation of citizenry, we can't have a proper elections that celebrate our democratic process. So it has great intentions, but it does have that sort of amusing. It is a documentary propaganda piece made in 1945, so it definitely has that sort of propaganda feel to it. But it does have a number of famous faces popping up as sort of doing their little bit parts for the government efforts, as you get in a lot of these. And the reason why it's included here is that Nicholas Ray is credited as as the assistant director, essentially. So again, as Indicator has done with all of these, they are able to even find something, if it's tangentially related and played an important part in somebody's career. This for Nicholas Ray, before he got his big break as a director, he was working as an assistant director, including this World War II propaganda short. So it's a fascinating inclusion and fits perfectly, because it's always nice to get that sort of background for somebody's career, even if it's something like this that is literally an old World War II propaganda short. Then we also get the film's theatrical trailer, which is actually included in HD, which is a real surprise. Most films of this era usually don't have a trailer that survives in good condition, or if it does survive, it was transferred to SD, and it's a standard F transfer that's been put on every release, and it's not a very good print copy. It's usually something they don't put a lot of effort into. So to get an inclusion of a trailer of a 40s film even with an HD scan of the trailer is really impressive. So that was a really nice surprise to see. And of course, I love trailers like I love posters. I love studying how films were sold and what scenes they chose and the funny taglines they came up with and all that stuff. So I think it's essential to have quality presentations of films and their trailers as well. Then we have the image gallery with both set stills, production stills, promotion, and publicity material, in addition to the various posters. So once again, as I said before, the Indicator photo galleries on this set are outstanding and full of beautiful high-res images that you can just find yourself staring at for ages, because you can just literally step through at your leisure. So it's an incredible little gallery. Shouldn't say little. It's all of these are between usually 30 to 50 stills or more. And again, having the posters and the lobby cards at the end is a really wonderful touch. Then again, to close out, we have the new and improved English subtitles for the deaf and hard of hearing, and that this was the film's UK Blu-ray premiere. Again, this did have a few other releases in other territories from the same HD master, but definitely nowhere near as lovingly presented as this release is. So this makes a wonderful inclusion. It's one of Bogart's strongest films produced by Santana. It's one of the best of the Santana group of films, I would say, and it's one of the best films in this set. So, and of course, directed by Nicholas Ray as well. So this is one of the great films that makes it worth the purchase of the whole set for. Next up is 1949's Tokyo Joe, which is a film that is rarely discussed in Bogart's filmography, and if it is, it usually doesn't have the greatest reputation in the world. But it's a film I'm very fond of, and it was one of the primary reasons why I was so much looking forward to this set and finally seeing it in HD, because it does have some really nice photography. I've always been sort of a sucker for this sort of setting. This was the first film to really showcase post-war Japan, and actually does have quite a bit of on-location location footage that was shot, and obviously mixed with studio footage of Bogart and the other actors. But as a film, it's often labeled as trying to repeat a lot of Casablanca's formula, as some Bogart vehicles were labeled as sort of being Casablanca light or Casablanca ripoffs. But this film is, while you can I kind of understand why people would feel that. I think it's a bit unfair to say it's simply a Casablanca knockoff. But in Tokyo Joe, Bogart's character is a former saloon owner who, after the war and serving in the war, tries to go back to Japan where he was living and go back to the bar he was running. Of course, complications arise as soon as he gets there. It's a completely different landscape, and the whole culture has changed, seeing as it is Japan under the American occupation, which is a particular period of time that is not often covered or gone into, and it's a really fascinating part of the aftermath of the war and what that did to Japanese culture. Of course, over the course of the story, there is a former lost flame love interest that is, I think, along with the sort of love triangle that's sort of inherent in the storytelling, and the fact that there's a sort of nefarious villain. That's where you get this sort of Casablanca overtones, and I think everybody was cognizant of that while making the film, but it was not designed to be an out-and-out Casablanca knockoff. There is also a song that is played in the film that is part of the character's romantic back history, and again, you can understand why people would consider this a Casablanca knockoff. But I do think it has enough strengths of its own, and it does sort of develop into more of a melodrama, especially when you have the Bogart character starting to get involved with the emerging underworld figures in the sort of new Japan after the war. And it's, I think, most fascinating to see how the Bogart character navigates through this. It is a very typical sort of Bogart image that you have, and I think his actual image in this film is, I think, quite iconic, especially when he dons the bomber jacket and has the typical Bogie sardonic grace that we all know and love him for. But I think I've always reacted to the sort of world weariness that's here, and it again is benefiting from being a Santana produced film, not being a studio film. And I think that is what allows it to have a greater sense of flavor. And I've always been a sort of sucker for the sort of outside figure in Japan and sort of not fitting in with Japanese society. I've always sort of loved those stories. Of course, this would be later reflected in the great film The Yakuza from 1975 that Sidney Pollack made. And of course, I probably got this love of this particular type of story when I was a kid, and really when I read Fleming's You Only Live Twice novel, where that is entirely what the story revolves around. And I can't help but get the feeling, since Fleming, like everyone else, was a great Bogart fan. Some of the films in this set, including Tokyo Joe, I think do, or perhaps could have said to be a slight influence on at least the Bond novels, if not the films eventually. There's also a great number of wonderful other performances, particularly from the wonderful Teruo Shimada. The fact that they're playing old friends, and the fact that when Bogie first comes back, they wind up having a judo fight in the bar, and just literally having a friendly judo bout, and cracking up laughing the whole time. If that scene doesn't sell you on the picture, that scene is worth the price of admission alone, even though they're obviously using stunt doubles in the long shots and all of the, well, pretty much the whole thing, but it's still a wonderful gag. And then the real highlight is that this was really the re-entry into films for Sessue Hayakawa, who had basically had to sort of hide out in France during the war, and had a very illustrious career in the silents and early talkies. And without this film, it is very likely that he wouldn't have re-entered films until quite a bit later, and possibly might not have got his most iconic role in The Bridge on the River Kwai. And he's a wonderful presence in this film. I think the whole film is really one of those things where the script is not necessarily up to par, but I think everyone during the production realized this, particularly director Stuart Heisler, and he and Bogart and everyone really, I think, conspired to try and improve on it as much as they could. So you're probably not going to respond necessarily to the actual way the plot is doled out, because it is rather straightforward. It's much more the atmosphere, the particular setting in post-war Japan, and the actual performances. So it's not just the window dressing, but it's the actual nuances that everyone in both cast and crew brings to the film that I think enhances the experience. So while the script is, it is a bit, it leaves you definitely wanting, particularly in the ending, which is sort of left open-ended, although it seems pretty clear what exactly it's indicating, and it has nice dramatic dark a downbeat aspect to it, I should say. But that definitely is, I think, a great example of how the film sort of leaves you wanting it. It's not as definite as you wish it would be. But I think it's always the atmosphere that I've really responded to with this film. So for me personally, it's one of my absolute favorite of Bogart's later career films post Warner Brothers and outside of Warner Brothers. And while it's technically not the best film in this set, it's possibly my favorite one, along with the Harder They Fall. I really think it's the atmosphere in this film, and it's also got a lot of additional layers that you don't quite expect. While some things seem very similar to Casablanca and other things seem pretty straightforward, it's not just a simple love triangle. It's not just the lost love come back who was presumed dead. That once that's revealed, there's extra developments there that put the Bogart character in a slightly different light that's not necessarily as clear-cut heroic. So there are quite a number of shades of gray in terms of giving a more realistic portrait of things. Another standout would be the actor Alexander Knox, who plays the now husband of the lost love character, who's played by Florence Marley in the film. But what's most interesting about this love triangle is here you have the husband, who is a truly good and honest person who understands and knows the backstory of what his wife and Bogart's character had gotten up to, and the fact that they were actually married, and the things that his wife was forced to do during the war come to light as well. But he knows the situation and allows things to play out, but also while still fully supporting his wife. So he is fully cognizant of everything going on. He isn't kept in the dark, and he doesn't become enraged or mad or jealous or anything, but he behaves like a honest, good, normal person, which is really striking because that's something you don't really get, especially in a 1940s film where you have a pretty sort of standard love triangle, at least on the surface. Another interesting little bit is you have Bogart on screen confronted by children. So that's another sort of fascinating little bit. And of course, this coincides with Bogart actually having his first child finally. And you get to see on screen what you read about in books and anecdotes, that sort of complete fascination and befuddlement when Bogart is presented with a child directly in front of him, and he doesn't quite know what to do. And it's a fascinating little miniature little piece inside this film where you have the quintessential tough guy of the screen, who you always knew had a deep, great heart underneath the cynicism, but to see him just completely nonplussed when presented with this little girl, it's especially if you know more about Bogart and his personal life, you can't help but to think of that's a perfect representation of how he probably was in real life at the time, because being at a more advanced age, having a child and then not quite knowing what to do, it's fascinating getting to see that on screen. But I think what is most striking overall is the fact that the film does try to treat the Japanese with a great deal of respect. There are not any real caricatures or standardized, oh well, everybody's a villain or everybody's out for themselves, so on and so forth. It does try to at least give you an idea of how difficult it was to live under the American occupation, how the Japanese were struggling to deal with their loss in the war, and how that affected the culture and sort of national pride and things like that. This is mostly done through the Teruo Shimada character, but it is striking for a Hollywood film of this time period, and only a couple years after the end of the war, to try and actually treat Japan and its people, seriously and with a good deal of respect. So that, I think, is the film's most positive attribute. Again, there's a good degree of that, but again, the script is pretty straightforward. So this is a film where the script does really kind of hold it back, but it is a film where everybody did really put in a lot of extra effort to try and at least make it a bit better and to sort of actually get off the ground. So again, while it is typically written off as not a very good film and more of a programmer, which every company needed programmers to make money to keep the company going, which Santana was really struggling to have to do. I think this film, it is obviously a solid programmer, but I think the atmosphere, the setting, and the good intentions of everyone, plus the added benefit of having some really great supporting cast members and some really striking shots of actual footage of post-war Japan, where they're actually walking around Tokyo. I think that does really heighten the mood, and I think Stuart Heisler does a really interesting job in terms of trying to improve the material that's not really there on the page. So again, the script does hold it back, but I still really enjoy this film. I think it is very well made. I do think you can understand the arguments of people saying it does sort of rehash some Casablanca elements, but I think calling it a Casablanca knockoff is a bit unfair. I think it's fine to have echoes of the film, as it does pop up in a lot of Bogie films, and everyone recognized that. But this for me, again, is probably my favorite of the sort of, I guess you could call them mid to late career Bogart programmers, if you will, of films that didn't have the greatest reputation. They were sort of kind of a bit more like a typical B film or low tier A film programmer, but it's the wonderful atmosphere in the film that I think really has sold it for me. And particularly Bogart's performance is really excellent because you have all that great degree of the world weariness that he could carry with him. And I love the idea of Bogart, the quintessential American tough guy, being in another country, in foreign lands, and sort of being the ultimate expatriate, which of course you could then once again say, oh, well, that's like Casablanca. So again, there are many parallels and echoes of Casablanca, but I think they're sort of woven in a fun way that it's interesting to note them, but I don't think that necessarily makes it, oh, well, they're just ripping off Casablanca again. Now to talk about the picture, this is another of Sony's HD remasters, so this is pretty much the same thing that turned up on the old DVD release. The DVD was reissued as part of the Bogart Columbia collection that was tied to TCM a couple years afterward, but it was pretty much the same transfer, although it didn't look as good as Sony's original DVD. It does have some printed in issues in terms of, as anything, that doesn't have a full frame-by-frame restoration. So if you've seen the film on DVD, you will sort of already know the general appearance here. Here there is some frame wobble that pops up once in a while, but it's very minor. There are one or two little bits of a sort of fluctuation effect. You'll notice in one spot, and then also in the ending where it's the particular shots that take place almost in an entire complete darkness. So for the most part, the issues are very, very minor in terms of the print element that was used. So again, this is an older master, but I do think that the bump up to 1080p is really impressive. I think especially in the black levels, everything seems much more nuanced, and I already thought the DVD looked pretty darn good. So this is basically just a nice improvement over that, given a lovely indicator treatment. The audio is once again PCM mono. It is seemingly the same source because it is, again, Sony's HD master. So it seems like it sounds pretty much like what was on the old DVDs. It does sound rather healthy, and there are no real discernible issues that I can point out. However, there is one point at just about over an hour into the film when the Bogart character is being questioned by the army brass in Tokyo, and he's sort of doing his beautiful cynical routine with them and having a sort of back and forth. But there is one particular line that sounds sort of off key that it seems to be underlining things, and it's about the underworld figures that Bogart is involved with. It might be part of some communist plot, and that feels, if it sounds weird, I think it's because it seems obviously dubbed in after the fact as something to sort of make it much more clear, and that this film was cooperating with our army personnel in terms to try and get cooperation and things like that. So it seems very much tacked on. That's why it sounds out of place, and I think that's simply because it was a line that was dubbed in. So again, that's the only thing I think you can really point out in terms of the audio presentation, that one line, and it sounded that way on the DVD. So I remember the first time I saw this film, that line felt out of place, and again, it seems like something that was done in post-production and just literally dubbed in there, so it doesn't quite match the rest of the scene. But that's the one real notable thing I think you could say about the audio of this release. Now to talk about the packaging. Once again, we have lovely original poster art, beautifully printed with very bold color in this lovely slimline case. I should also mention that all of these get their own spine numbers, as Indicator does with these. Apologies for the glare. Here is the interior with another poster choice, and then the lovely disc label. I do really like that all the disc labels are matching black and white in this set, and for all the Noir sets, really. So it's a very small thing, but I do really appreciate it when they take the time to try and make it match. That, of course, is the same image used for the disc tray. And then here is the rear, once again, with a wonderful, cheeky, original tagline across the top. So this is the most stuffed disc in the set in terms of extras. So while some may feel the film is not that great, it does absolutely have an incredible supplemental package that is also full of historical importance. So we have credited, this is Sony's HD remaster with the original mono audio. We have a featurette from an older release which is literally entitled Bertrand Tavernier on Tokyo Joe. This is where Tavernier talks about his views on the film and Bogart and Bogart's importance in France and essentially how he's looked at the film and Stuart Heisler's career over the years. He makes no bones about it. He doesn't like the film very much, doesn't think it's very good, but at least, I can respect his opinion. It's usually it's pretty similar to what I've heard from others, but of course I'm the whole time going, it's better than you think. You should go see it again. But it's a really lengthy piece. It's actually 35 minutes, and what's really great is, of course, he's speaking in French, and it was available on previous French releases, but Indicator actually did brand new custom subtitles for it. So when you watch it, the subtitles literally say, generated by and made by Powerhouse Indicator. So they actually took the time to sit there and make subtitles for those of us who were curious to hear Tavernier's thoughts on Tokyo Joe and Bogart and Stuart Heisler. It's a really nice piece, and it's one of two that are in this set. But it was really wonderful to see that, and then actually, know that they took the time to make subtitles for it, so we could enjoy Tavernier's thoughts for those of us who can't speak French, because I'm terrible with foreign languages. Next is a piece entitled "A Superstar Returns," which runs about 15 minutes, which is Tom Vincent talking about the career of Sessue Hayakawa and how this film really marked the return for him into Hollywood feature films and what that meant, and again, that sort of put him on the path that eventually got him to The Bridge on the River Kwai. Hayakawa was really a pioneer in many different ways, and few people are aware at just how successful he became in the earlier days of his career, and how it's really a shame that that Hollywood didn't really allow him to maintain that. And then, of course, the war didn't help, and essentially took him out of film acting for quite some time. So it was really a sign of, I think, Bogart's commitment to making at least intelligently based films, even if they occasionally were programmers like this, and his desire to really seek out very talented, intelligent people on both sides of the camera. So without Bogart's insistence and his sway as producer and it being under his company, it obviously wouldn't have been Hayakawa hired to do Tokyo Joe. And yeah, that's another sign, I think, of Bogart's commitment to at least trying to make pictures that meant something, even if they came out and they didn't exactly work and nobody really thought much about them. They are always at least several cuts above the typical studio product at the time. Then, in a really fascinating touch, they have included it's 11 minutes of second unit photography, which was done by Joseph Baroque and Emil Oster Jr. in Tokyo, and this is all of the footage they were shooting for the plates that were used in the studio and the in-between footage of stand-ins walking around the actual Tokyo streets. So it's 11 minutes of the material they shot, and it has actually been scanned at 4K, so the quality is exceptional, and it is an incredible time capsule to see Tokyo in 1948 during the occupation in the post-war years exactly as it was. So it's basically extended shots of the little glimpses you get in the film that's used as the in-between sort of glue to give you that atmosphere. But the fact that it's been scanned at 4K and presented here in this fashion, it's just fascinating to look at, and basically goes all the way to the camera cutting in all these shots. So basically, you get the heads and tails of what of the footage that was used in the film, plus a few other little interesting bits. So I think it's absolutely fascinating for any history buffs out there. But it's just a fascinating glimpse into what was it like in Tokyo at that time, and also what was it like for the cameramen out there just trying to get all kinds of different footage and, photographing a city bus or a city street or a marketplace, and then, slating it and letting the camera run and trying to get sort of documentary flavor, little bits and pieces. But most importantly, for historical purposes, this includes a brand new transfer of the extraordinarily important World War II propaganda piece that Stuart Heiser directed, which was, of course, it has a different title, but I'll just say The Black Soldier. It was designed to try and build war morale and also be a sort of recruitment short for trying to get African Americans to sign up for the war effort and join the army. But of course, it did have to, obviously, the army was actually very concerned about the fact that I don't think they really wanted it to get out that the army was segregated and the treatment of African American soldiers was not, shall we say, very good. And it was a very difficult thing for them to sort of tiptoe around, and how to make a film as a propaganda piece to encourage African Americans to enlist, but also not go into the fact that the conditions were pretty bad. So what Heiser and Company really did was, obviously they weren't allowed to show things the way they really were, and that would not work for a recruitment or morale booster. But what they wound up doing was really showcasing what looked like a completely integrated army, and showing not just African American soldiers participating at the time as equals, and showing black actors and people as not caricatures, but as equals to everyone else. Because, of course, there are framing devices setting up all of the footage and the material of showing essentially the indoctrination of new soldiers. But it was getting more at the idea of also the history of black soldiers in previous conflicts throughout American history, and going all the way back to the Boston Massacre, for example. But it's this general idea of showing a possible vision of America and the world where there was integration everywhere, and there was no difference between ethnicities that really made the film so striking, and the Army was so pleased with it, and it was so successful that it was no longer just shown to troops, it was actually shown in theaters to the general public and received much critical praise. It is a very striking example of what the War Department films produced. So, as a historical artifact, its importance is absolutely incredible. It is part of the National Film Registry for good reason. However, you do have to also look at what it was not saying about the real and true conditions of the Army for black soldiers at the time. And that's why it's really important to look at the next extra, which is a BFI Q&A interview after a screening of the film with Jim Pines. It's audio only. It runs 41 minutes, but he talks about the film, its production, and all the things that it glossed over and didn't get into, but also the fact that it still should be examined as a truly important historical document of viewpoints of the time, and at least trying to have some positivity of what could be, even though it was done in the guise of a Army propaganda short during the war. So it is, without question, one of the most important of the World War II propaganda pieces that was produced. Its historical significance is incredible. And when you view it today, on this release, for example, you can get the sense of what Heiser and others were trying to do with the constraints of what they were given and the constraints, unfortunately, of the time period. So while it does very much present a view of integration in the Army that did not exist, the ideas that it displays, that there could be a world where everyone was equal, and there was not the sort of inherent racism in even the government and the army, and that people didn't act like caricatures and could be seen as actual fellow American citizens. It is a very striking example of at least someone trying to present a possible view of really the present at the time, not necessarily a view of the future, but how America could be. And it's that I think is the most striking aspect of seeing the film. And I think that's why it's very important to have the additional extra of the BFI interview. And again, it is audio only, but it is a very lengthy sort of 41-minute piece. And the way it's presented is you basically watch the film over with this as sort of laid out as the commentary for it. So I think that is very essential to understand the importance of this and its very glaring shortcomings due to not actually depicting things as the way they were, but at least having that wonderful sort of idealism inherent. So for its historical importance, it is an incredible inclusion here, and made all the better by the fact that it is a brand new scan. It's not some old standard def master transferred. It is not restored fully, so it does have a lot of baked in damage and things. These films were run over and over and over again, but to have a new transfer of this and have it included, and it was the main contribution of Stuart Heiser to the propaganda films that he was part of. It's very much important to have it here as a sort of background for what Heiser was doing during the war. We also get the wonderful image gallery, again beautifully done, just like the rest of the ones on this set. Wonderful original production stills, publicity materials, set stills, and then it goes into a gallery of the posters and lobby cards for both the US and international releases. So once again, an absolutely outstanding image gallery. And Indicator has again done brand new and improved subtitles, and this was also the UK premiere for the film on Blu-ray. And I have saved the best for last. If you've seen my review of Indicator's release of the classic The Criminal Code, you'll know how much I went on about Nora Fiore's commentary on that I was just blown away at how amazing and involving it was. So she was the person who did the commentary on Tokyo Joe. And once again, it is a blast to listen to, an absolute treat, and one of the best commentary tracks I've heard in years. It's just as good as her track for the Criminal Code. It is jam-packed with information, but presented with great humor and energy. And this is even acknowledging that the film isn't the greatest and does have a lot of Casablanca similarities, and most people just write it off or just say out and out it's a bad film. But she gets all of that out of the way pretty much at the beginning. And it's the joy of hearing her commentary tracks, I think, is not just that it's jam-packed with information, and she's obviously done tons of research and is able to lay things out in a wonderful conversational manner with humor and wit. And if you've ever read any of her Twitter posts or blog posts as the Nitrate Diva, you would know she has a great sense of wit and humor talking about classic films. But it's the sense that you're not just hearing a critic or somebody giving their thesis on a film, or just, unfortunately, like most commentaries where they're just describing the action on screen. But it's the sense you get that you've got a sort of fellow conspirator, if you will, of somebody who has seen the film before, and so that way you have somebody to actually talk to about the film. It's that sense of participation that gets generated of, hey, here's how this film went, and look at all the sinews of how it was made and how that shows up in the film. And yeah, it's not perfect, but look, isn't this fascinating? And then this happened in the production, and this is why this happened. And it's that sort of engaging the listener, so that way you don't feel like you're alone watching Tokyo Joe for the 10th time at 2 o'clock in the morning, because that's just what you find yourself doing, and feeling like you're the only person in the world who's ever seen this film more than once or twice and actually really likes it. So that definitely helps. But it's that sense of sort of having a somebody else who gets that point of view, and that is the most striking aspect of her commentaries that I've heard so far, and it is just an absolute blast. And again, you can clearly tell she's done the research and really put the time in, and it's also very difficult to get all of that into a commentary track and make it enjoyable, and also run along with the events of the film and not get tongue-tied. Once you've done a commentary yourself, you very much understand how difficult it is to really pull off, and she makes it seem effortless. So I would be hard pressed. Of course, the year's not over yet, but I would be hard pressed to name anything else in terms of when I do my usual end of the year sort of awards things. But I'm pretty much convinced this is the commentary of the year. It is a blast to listen to, and the single best extra in the entire set. It's that good. It's going to be a track I'm going to return to every time I rewatch the film. It is that good. It is that informative. And while it does cover some of the same material gone over in some of the other extras, there is additional material here, and the wit and humor and conversational tone really make it all the more wonderful and engaging. So again, the best extra in the whole set that is already filled with amazing extras, and absolutely, this is probably the commentary of the year, without question. I mean, to say that this really echoed a lot of my own thoughts on the film that I've had before, and I thought, oh, it's just me being a Bogie nerd thinking about Tokyo Joe way too much. She even quotes my favorite anecdote from Stephen Bogart's memoir, Bogart's son, about Bogart and trying to figure out how to relate to kids, and when he had to take his godson out once, he didn't know what to say, and so somebody said, "Oh, you should you're his godfather. You should tell him about religion." So the kid later relates what Mr. Bogart said, and he said, "Mr. Bogart said, 'Listen, kid, there are 12 commandments.'" And then he ordered a drink, and that was it. So when she used that anecdote in the commentary pretty early, I'm like, okay, yes, we're on the same wavelength. Thank goodness somebody actually loves this film like I do, because I thought I was like the only one. And especially after hearing Bertrand Tavernier go on about how the film wasn't any good, so I was like, there is redemption. Thank goodness. So That's why Tokyo Joe is the most stuffed disc in terms of the extras. It does make up for it if you're not a fan of this film or you feel that it's a bit lesser, but I do really think it has strong points to it that do elevate it over some of the other more programmer type films that Bogart would do, and also with the Santana Corporation. And because it's a Santana production, I think it does have some greater degree of realism than it would have had it been, say, a Warner Brothers film at the same time period. So that's why it was title is really looking forward to seeing on Blu-ray in HD, even though it's just Sony's HD master. But the supplements really put it over the top, and this is the most stuffed disc in the set, with the very important World War II documentary and the must-listen outstanding commentary that Nora Fiore did. So again, I can go on about her commentary for ages because it was so much fun and so well done. And again, I think it's the commentary of the year, and the year's not even over yet, but that's how good it is. Next, we move to 1951's Sirocco, which is frequently described, like Tokyo Joe, as being a Casablanca knockoff or having many Casablanca elements and trying to repeat the iconic film's success. Like Tokyo Joe, I do think that argument can be made, but I do think it is a little bit unfair, as when you see the film, even though it does have some of the trappings of Casablanca, obviously, but it does seem to actually be trying to imitate a different film as well. And there is a quote mentioned in the commentary by the film's producer Robert Lord that they were really trying to go after the feel of The Third Man, which is very much the film I was reminded of, or one of the films I was reminded of, because the film does have great atmosphere of trying to portray the time period of the French occupation of Syria in the 1920s. The film takes place, I believe, in 1925 exactly. It's a particular portion of history that I think most people are probably not going to be very well aware of, but it does give a nice background for the setting and the sort of black market and black market operations that run in the city of Damascus. So that's why you definitely get Third Man vibes, and of course Casablanca vibes as well. So I can understand people wanting to label this a sort of rehashing of Casablanca elements once again, but I do think it has its own flavor and identity, which is coupled with a darker sensibility because it is 1951. It is from that period of time where noirs had gotten even darker by the late 1940s, and in the transition into the 50s, even though the rest of the country was starting to transition out of the darker realms of entertainment, shall we say, the genre pictures and genre fiction were getting even darker, as this was getting into the era of Mickey Spillane. I think fittingly, one of the screenwriters of this film, A.I. Bezerides, would famously go on to write the screenplay for the best Spillane adaptation, the film version of Kiss Me Deadly, in 1955. Unfortunately, this film, it cannot be said that the script is very strong because it's sort of all over the place. It is very much, I think, if you could term a film a misfire, I think this one definitely has, it pretty much does feel like a misfire. There are many great elements to it. Again, the whole notion of setting the film in the 1920s in this sort of black market occupation period of France, being in Syria and in the city of Damascus. And Bogart appears on the scene as essentially a black marketeer and gun runner for the Syrian rebels against the French government, but he clearly has no political viewpoints whatsoever and is merely out for his own self-interest. And it is a particular rendering of what you could term the Bogartian hero, if you will, very much with elements of Rick Blaine, obviously. So again, that leads people to just automatically label it a Casablanca knockoff. But here he is perhaps even more cynical and completely self-interested, and has no desire to get involved in anyone's political situation or problems. So there is a greater degree of coldness, which I think again heightens the sort of attempts at realism, and you could almost give him some labeling of, in some ways, in terms of the character, he's playing a much more Harry Lime type character. So again, the idea of the third man really permeates this film. And the third man sort of a connection is heightened by the lead female role. The sort of love interest of the film is this mysterious sort of character from obviously from another country with an accent and looking very beautiful, but seeming very mysterious and sort of removed a little bit. She's played in this film by Marty Turin, who looks very similar to the actress Vali, who was famously in The Third Man, and apparently that's who they originally wanted to get or discussed trying to cast in this film. And it does very much seem to be a character in that sort of mold, and there are times where she looks very similar. But I do think she and Bogart have a really interesting chemistry in this film, and I think I wish that had been developed a bit further. Lee J. Cobb has the other meaty role as sort of the French officer who believes he can strike a deal with the Syrian rebels, and instead of having to have endless battles where many men are killed on both sides. However, there is a sort of subplot of him also being completely and pathologically jealous of the affections of his beloved not necessarily being returned, and when she starts to sort of become more involved and more interested, and obviously her affections turn more towards the Bogart character and his sort of rakish charm, and of course being the black marketeer, it basically fires off all of the Cobb character's jealousy and rage, and it seems to come out of nowhere, but that's the subplot that feeds into the climax of the film, where we have the characters seeping deeper into the dark underworld of Damascus, and also as the conflict between the French occupation forces and the Syrian rebels get even worse. And it's that particular factor, plus some of the events that happen in the film, that do very much give it a real world parallel and even make it striking today. There, in particular, there's a sequence relatively early in the film where the Bogart character and all the other primary cast of the film find themselves in a very atmospheric nightclub, and then someone comes in off the street and secretly plants a bomb inside, and it actually goes off, and a great number of people are terribly hurt, injured, maimed, or even killed. And then we get the immediate aftermath of everybody staggering to their feet. And it's probably the most striking moment of the film is they actually stage this sequence and do it extremely realistically. And then the great bit is, even with people screaming and wailing, and they're carrying the dead bodies out, you see everybody start to stagger up, and what does Bogie do but immediately start lighting a cigarette, even though his suit is torn and he's covered in dirt and dust and some dried blood and everything. It's just a wonderful, wonderful moment, and that's why you come to this film, because there are a number of really great little character performances as well. Even Zero Mostel has a nice a nice character part in the film, and he's not in it for very long, but even the great Everett Sloane pops up as the commanding French officer in charge of the forces occupying the city, and he has one or two nice little bits with Lee J. Cobb, but unfortunately it's not really enough, and it sort of feels like it's a different film because nothing seems to quite gel in terms of the stories that are being told. The whole backdrop of the French occupying forces feels much more like a different movie when we're seeing the scenes of them talking about the situation. Then we go back into the world of the black market with the Bogart character. But before I start to sound too harsh on the film, I do think, again, it has a wonderful atmosphere. The black and white photography is quite lovely, again, courtesy of Bernard Guffey. But I think the real draw and the moments when you know you will be your time is not being wasted when you sit up straighter and you're immediately involved. Every time Bogart appears on screen, it is the adage that Raymond Chandler famously quoted: all Bogart has to do to dominate a scene is to enter it. And that's what happens in this film every single time. So even if the film isn't working for you, even if the plot doesn't quite gel and the subplots are not as involving, and you're really just invested in the atmosphere and trying to see what happens to the Bogart character, whenever Bogie is on the screen, your eyes are drawn to him, and he gives a great performance, and it's full of his increased world weariness and cynicism that was on full display here, and in his later career films, even ones like this where it obviously wasn't working out, and it turned out to be sort of a misfire, and it wasn't a successful film, and it wasn't one of his iconic films like The African Queen he was doing around this time period. He still had that quality, and it is a star performance, not in a showy way or anything, but that's why you come to this film, and he is, as always, outstanding, and is the most fascinating thing in the film. The one true fascinating thing is the character and the performance that he's giving, because it's a different rendering of the Bogart type hero who is really not displaying any heroic qualities. And that's why I think the unfortunate part of the film, the weakest part, is the finale and conclusion, where the Bogart character winds up doing a more heroic, noble type act. Again, that's harkening back towards everybody saying it's a Casablanca knockoff, but it's not really earned, and it's not really set up very well. They just kind of present him with this choice, and he really has no reason to agree to do this. There's nothing forcing him to do so, and it's as if he just says, "Oh, screw it, I'll try it anyway because I'm bored. I don't care what happens." So there's a bit of a sort of flippant cynicism to it, I guess you could say, but it's not really earned narratively or dramatically, and it does feel just sort of forced and tacked on, which is, I think, the single weakest element of the film, is that the ending doesn't really quite feel earned. But the final moments of the film are nicely done, and it does have a very dark, very open-ended conclusion, which is fitting of a noir of this time period, even though this is taking place in a historical period setting in another country in a particular historical event in time that was not something that a lot of people talked about or really even knew about at the time. So the picture was also a hard sell. So I do really enjoy the title. The title refers to the Sirocco wind that sweeps through, so I guess that was perhaps supposed to be indicating the sort of perhaps the wind of change sweeping through the sort of civil war going on between the rebels and the French occupying forces. But it's a film that nothing quite comes together fully, and so your mileage is going to vary what you are able to take from it. A lot of people simply write it off again as a Casablanca knockoff, but I do think that is unfair, because it does have enough of its own identity, and it does have a fascinating backdrop and atmosphere and an incredible lead Bogie performance. But unfortunately, I don't think the elements really come together into a cohesive whole. There, again, are a lot of great individual ideas. I do really like the interplay between Bogart and Turenne. They do have a nice chemistry together, and they seem to really spark off of each other. But I think the Cobb is kind of wasted in the role he's given. He does very well, has a couple nice speeches and things, but a lot of the subplots, and again the character's jealousy towards the love interest, does feel rather forced. Again, a sign of the script having many different elements and it's just not really seeming to come together. So again, while I do think the film is a bit of a misfire, I do think the atmosphere and the really deep-seated cynicism of the film, along with the particular setting, really do differentiate it enough to make it an interesting watch. But I think what will keep you coming back to it and have what has the most lasting impact is Bogart's performance, which again I think is superb. And when he is on screen, you are not bored and you're not confused as to where the plot is going and trying to figure this picture out. But it's unfortunately when he's not on screen that you start to poke holes and where the plot is going, and you start scratching your head a little bit. And ultimately, when the film concludes, it is a mixed bag for sure. Again, most people just write it off, so that's why I was very pleased it was included in this set, because I hadn't seen it in some time, and I was really looking forward to revisiting it. And I think it is a better film the more you come back to it. Again, the atmosphere, I think, really helps. And for everyone calling it a Casablanca knockoff or ripping off Casablanca again, it's really trying to do the third man more. I think that's the atmosphere it's trying to go for. It's trying to do a more Graham Greene type story, and it doesn't exactly pull it off. Then it was based on a novel entitled Coup de Grace, which was, of course, a great title for anything. And according to the commentary, the novel was very different, so of course they had to adapt it quite heavily to try and make it into a film under the production code. So I would like to actually read the novel, because apparently it's almost entirely different in a lot of ways and much darker than the film is, which is, the film is already quite dark. But it is one of these films in this set where there was a lot of difficulty seemingly into trying to get it off the ground, and it doesn't quite work. So of the films in this set, I think there are two that are really, unfortunately, I think could be labeled misfires. This one, I think, is rather obvious. That the next film in the set, which I'll discuss, The Family Secret, I think is the other one that you could really probably say is a bit of a misfire. But I think Sirocco is much more obviously a misfiring film, because the script never quite comes together and doesn't quite work. So it's going to be, again, the atmosphere that really draws you in. And if you're into this type of story of sort of intrigue on the black market, under where you have a city sort of under siege and a civil war going on with an occupying force, and really the black market running everything, and then a sort of laconic, cynical figure weaving his way through simply for his own personal ends, as personified by Bogart here. Again, I think it has some really interesting aspects to it, but it is a misfire as a film, and it's not going to play well with everyone. So I hope I didn't sound too harsh on the film, because I did enjoy rewatching it. I hadn't seen it since Columbia's old DVD a number of years ago, and that was a Sony Preservation HD Master, which has been replicated here. So this is another title where it is Sony's HD Master that we're looking at. So in terms of the picture quality, this is very much a 1080p upgrade of what you saw on the old DVD. The condition of the source is quite solid, as with all of these. There are some age-related wear and other bits that are going to be inherent to the source, because this is, again, not a frame-by-frame restoration. It's not a brand new scan. However, actually getting it in HD well encoded on this indicator release does show the inherent strengths of the master that are obviously going to improve dramatically over the old DVD from many years ago. I think it came out in like 2003, so it is very much getting on up there in age. Almost 20 years old now, but I did think it had a very healthy appearance. There are quite a good majority of the film does take place at night in the cobbled city streets and dark alleyways and underground tunnels and things. Again, making you think of The Third Man. So there is quite a lot of blackness in the image in terms of the shadows. So this is not obviously a bright and sunny film experience. Now, in terms of damage, there are some speckles scattered throughout, a couple scratches here and there, nothing major. I did notice a tiny amount of frame wobble here and there, but again, that's like the previous other Sony Masters that are being reused, and that's going to be mostly inherent to any sort of source like this of a master that was done at this time without full frame by frame restoration. So, but there is a tiny touch of frame wobble here and there. There are one or two hairs that poke in, again, something that's going to be pretty commonplace, but I did see those. And then there are some occasional lines that show up. Again, nothing particularly major, usually just one or two faint ones here and there in one or two spots. There is a point at about getting towards the end of the film, about an hour and a half mark, I think it was, where there are at least several lines visible. But again, nothing too terribly major, but again, it is understandable for a film like this. Doesn't have the greatest reputation and is one of the more obscure films in Bogart's filmography, that it is not going to receive a 4K restoration anytime soon, unfortunately. But I did think it was a healthy improvement overall compared to the old DVD. The same with all these others. It's when you get these Sony Masters on a well-mastered Blu-ray disc, even if it's just a bump up to 1080p, the difference can often be quite striking. And especially on a black and white film, I think it really does enhance the viewing experience much more than just watching the old DVD upscaled. Now, in terms of the audio, it is lossless PCM. It is seemingly the same as the DVD, again, befitting they're reusing Sony's HD master, and it does sound quite nice. It is the film's original mono mix, and it has natural hiss to it. It sounds pretty much fine, but I did notice at least 2 spots where in some dialogue scenes there was a slight or very light hum underneath the dialogue. Again, it is very minor, and I only noticed it in 2 spots, but it is something you'll notice if you have a decent setup or you're paying attention to the actual audio, even though it's mono. It is noticeable, but it's probably something that's baked into the source, I would think. So again, that I don't mind that when it's part of the source and it doesn't destroy or ruin the audio. But I did notice 2 points where there was some light hum under the dialogue. But outside of that, it sounds fine. There is some natural distortion in the high end, especially in some of the music passages. So I don't know if that is just part of the original recording or that was just the source they had to use. But you will notice there is some high-end distortion for sure, and especially in the louder music cues and passages, which is pretty typical for a classic mono track, but it did seem a bit more pronounced. So that just may be the condition of the track itself, or that just may be how the track was recorded originally. So I do think it is overall in picture and sound a decent or healthy upgrade over the old DVD for sure. But again, it is still Sony's HD master. Now, to talk about the packaging, we have a lovely rendering of the original US poster art here, just like the others on the lovely indicator case. Lovely spine. Then the rear, and this has the best tagline in the set. Oh wow, they don't make taglines like that anymore. You get an even bigger rendering of that on the alternate poster that's on the inside. And then the disc label on this one is actually black, which they do on some of these. Almost all of them are white, but some of them are black to better match the interior artwork choice. Now, in terms of the extras, it's really surprising to get extras on a film like this that often gets derided if it's ever mentioned at all. Most Bogart books completely skip almost all of the Santana films, unfortunately, but it's really revealing and wonderful to get extras on this release. So we have the credit. This is Sony's HD master with the original mono audio. The new audio commentary for this release by historians Alexander Heller-Nicholas and Josh Nelson. It's a wonderful, lovely commentary track. They do go into a lot of the problems the film had getting off the ground, its development, and everyone's general misgivings about the film and how it turned out, the fact that it was not very successful and sort of came and went. But they do also a number of times speak about the differences with what's presented in the novel. So that got me interested in wanting to actually read the book because it seemingly is quite different in a lot of ways to what we got in the film and had to be toned down significantly to get past the production code, obviously. So it is a good track, and I'm amazed that this film actually has a commentary track now because, again, it's very much derided and overlooked. And one of the joys about rediscovering or trying to better appreciate films like this, even if they're a misfire on indicator releases, is that they go the extra mile and will even commission a commentary for a film like Sirocco that most people have either never heard of or simply write off as not being any good. So I do think it enhances your appreciation or your viewing of the film if you listen to the commentary. The next extra and the primary one on the disc is the episode of the South Bank show, Bogart, Here's Looking at You, Kid, which is an hour long from 1997. This is the same documentary that was included on Criterion's release of High Sierra. It's the excellent biography episode that actually involves Stephen Humphrey Bogart and his sort of trying to understand his father's life and legacy that he wrote about in the great book. That's a must-read for all Bogie fans, entitled In Search of My Father. So it's a biography on Bogart with great detail, but also it is essentially his son going through and trying to learn more about his father, who died when he was very young. So he is essentially discovering a lot about his father for the first time that he unfortunately never got to learn firsthand. So that adds an extra dimension of poignancy to the episode, but it's also an excellent overall biography view of Bogart and his life and career for those who are looking to know more about the legend and to get it in a nice distilled form. So if you're really starting fresh with Bogart, or you've never read the Spurburn Lax biography, this is a great place to start. It's still the best sort of video biography or biography episode, I think, on Bogart, or documentary, I should say. And it's great to see it included here, but again, it is the same documentary that is on Criterion's High Sierra release. But if you were looking for a Bogart biography or documentary, this is the one you'll want to watch. And we go on to the wonderful image gallery, also featuring promotional and publicity material. Once again, the gallery is fantastic, and it includes not just stills, set stills, but also publicity material, and then the US posters and a lot of the foreign alternate posters and lobby cards, which is fascinating. As I've said before, these are all beautiful high-res images, beautifully presented for you to step through, and it is a substantial image gallery, so it is very, very much a welcome addition. And then they go on to say again that they have done new and improved subtitles for the deaf and hard of hearing, and that this is actually the world premiere of the film on Blu-ray. Some of these other masters have been released, but this one had never gotten a disc release anywhere on Blu-ray, and that is a major win for this set, because even though I do think the film is a misfire, it does have a really fantastic Bogie performance, it does have great atmosphere, and it does have positives to it, and we get a lovely commentary to go along with it as well in this wonderful HD presentation that does advance over the DVD. So this is one of the films exclusive to this set on Blu-ray, and I do think it is a welcome inclusion, and it shows you what these lesser-known films could really represent for Bogart, the icon, but also Bogart, the producer, because this was, again, under his Santana Corporation banner at Columbia, so it does have the trappings of, say, Tokyo Joe in terms of its production, but it is a film that is unfortunately held back by the elements not really coming together and the constraints under which it was made. But I do think the positives are allowed to shine through, and I do think it does have enough of its own identity to not simply be labeled a Casablanca knockoff for all time, because that's all you ever read about or hear about is people calling it a knockoff of Casablanca, and it's like, well, no, it's got a lot of the third man in there, but I do find it an enjoyable experience, essentially. So I hope I haven't sounded too harsh on it, but I did really enjoy coming back to it, and I did enjoy seeing it again. It is a film that does grow on you, so don't let your first viewing put you off of it entirely. There are interesting bits in there, but the key is Bogart's extraordinary, very world-weary performance. Next is a film also from 1951, but this is the most interesting and attractive component of this box set, because this is a film that is extremely obscure. It's actually a film I'd never gotten to see until this point, and had only received a home video release before as part of Sony's MOD Choice DVD collection only a few years ago, and that's The Family Secret. This is one of the only Santana-produced films that does not star Humphrey Bogart, but he did have an active role in essentially acquiring the property and producing the film. And if you were to think that this film, not starring Bogart and having the title it has, wouldn't really qualify for being included in a Columbia Noir box set, as soon as the film opens, that would be put to rest, because there's a very actually a quite striking noir opening of the lead character essentially starting to run away after a murder has been committed, and then some lovely voiceover narration going as he essentially speeds away from the scene of the crime. But The Family Secret is based on a stage play. It deals with the story of a young man played again by John Derek in a role similar in a lot of ways to his Nick Romano in Knock on Any Door. But he essentially kills his best friend behind a roadhouse, which we don't see just before the film starts, in self-defense, or so he claims, That's something they don't really go into, but that sort of ambiguity is really interesting and very much very noir in its essence. And again, that goes into the very noir status of the opening because we don't see the actual event occurs. We only have to take the Derek character's word for what actually happened. But essentially, he kills his drunken friend who was coming at him. So he kills him in self-defense, and then in panic drives off, cleans his car, runs home, and in a wonderful gag goes into his house, and his parents are there entertaining and I think having a bridge game with the parents of his best friend, and he has to sit there and nod politely and act as if nothing has happened, knowing that sooner or later the police are going to discover or be called to the roadhouse and go out back and find his friend's dead body there after he just left it. And of course, his father's played by Lee J. Cobb, who is a famous lawyer in town, and very quickly puts two and two together that something's not quite right with this son, who is acting very, very strangely. And before the news is announced, essentially, that he does confess to what happened. And very quickly, they decide that he's going to go to the police station and report the incident and say that it was self-defense and essentially come clean to the events. But of course, his mother, played by Erin O'Brien Moore, quickly hears of this and suggests an alternative solution, because why should her son's life be destroyed for something that was merely an accident, and the police won't have to know about it anyway. So against his own better judgment, the Cobb character decides to abide by his son's wishes, and his son obviously decides to then not say anything, and thus we get the meaning of the title and the secret the family will carry with them, and essentially starts to tear them apart. Things are further compounded in a nice dramatic way because, of course, the police then find their prime suspect, and an innocent man is wrongly accused and arrested and put on trial. And the father, the Cobb character, is essentially coerced into defending the innocent man who he knows is innocent. And on top of that, his son, the John Derek character, is essentially an assistant lawyer in his office and is in the courtroom assisting things. So it makes it a bit of a sticky scenario. And also the innocent man is a nice sort of bit part for Whit Bissell, who even pops up in this film. Now, all of this seems like a nice, very interesting, dramatic setup, and I think that was what drew Bogart and others to the property. I think that's the main idea of the original play it was based on, and it seems like a good idea. Unfortunately, the film kind of squanders that idea because the John Derek character remains so completely unlikable and does nothing but selfish and unlikable acts that increase in their severity due to his increasing stress levels that are entirely of his own doing. So it's very hard for the audience to associate with this character who seemingly just goes about his daily life and becomes even more insufferable. But it does reach several points where you think it's going to finally pick up, or he's going to sort of see the light or something. But interestingly, that does not happen, and he continues along this path that does, again, maintain that sort of noir edge. There is a love interest in the film played by Jodie Lawrence, who I think is really the highlight of the film. Her character is very, very self-reliant. There is nice chemistry between her and the John Derek character of David Clark, and David does actually reach his lowest point, and she is able to essentially defend herself and get out of said situation, and it does go to darker places, which is very interesting. But unfortunately, that doesn't save it from being unfortunately leaving a sort of bad taste in the mouth when you get to the ending, because the David character is so completely irredeemable, and there is a sort of point of no return that is reached, and then the film goes past that, and then we get the ending does have a very sort of tacked on feeling and very code enforced. Nothing bad, but it definitely is very jarring. So I think the film may have worked better, perhaps, because of course I thought the premise was so promising and there were great things in it. So I've been mulling over it for some time after seeing it. But I think the film might have been more effective had it focused more on Lee J. Cobb's character and his own internal struggles, and then it probably would have turned into more of a courtroom drama. Or they could have focused more on the Jody Lawrence character and kept the David character as more mysterious and perhaps hiding murderous tendencies, which might have pushed it more into a Hitchcock territory with perhaps some Shadow of a Doubt vibes, since this is set in a smaller American town, or a mixture of the two, or had something more for the actors to do, because I think they are the two highlights of the film. And I do think Jody Lawrence steals all the scenes she has, and is a really wonderful presence. And there are some great surprises with her character, particularly the fact that when she goes to drive off, she doesn't have a normal car. She has an old roadster that's got a gigantic engine, and she has to bang it into shape, and it's supercharged and everything, and she just roars off. So that's a wonderful surprise in this film that you don't expect, and it's very much a sign of the very independent nature and streak of her character. And again, you kind of wish the film was about her instead. Unfortunately, she's so good in this film that it's a shame to then you wonder why you haven't seen her in other things. But she unfortunately did not do very well in the studio system, because she was not a fan of studio politics. And this is one of her earliest films, but she only really appeared sporadically in the years afterwards. But it's really unfortunate, because she's great in this film and has a great screen presence and great energy. And of course, her character has this wonderful sort of pick yourself up by the bootstraps and go get 'em attitude, which also makes the ending feel very jarring, because it goes against what her character has sort of represented through the rest of the film. And some people say, the few people who apparently have seen this film to actually write about it and comment on it, John Derek is basically playing a role that is very similar to his turn as Nick Romano, as I said before. So when you watch the films in this set, you will obviously be reminded the whole time of Knock on Any Door. However, while you feel sympathy for Nick Romano in certain ways, here it's very difficult to feel sympathy for the David character, because his actions make him extraordinarily dislikable and disagreeable, and they increase in severity. And instead of trying to overcome his situations or even behave like a normal, decent person, he frequently does the opposite, and it just gets worse. And again, there is a point of no return that is reached, and then he goes past that. So once that happens, it is pretty much impossible for the audience to feel anything for this character. And then again, with the ending sort of having a positive note to it that feels very unrealistic and unwarranted, and it does leave a bad taste in the mouth in certain ways. So that's why I do think this film does misfire in certain ways. I do think the concept is great, and I do think it's solidly made. It was directed by Henry Levin, but it does, due to its shorter length, and it was not really received very well. It very much played in theaters in a flash of light and it was gone, which I do mention in the commentary. It played at some theaters for merely a few days, if only a week or two at best, before it was gone. And then it went right into obscurity, not getting a video release until, again, Sony's Choice MOD DVD line. But it is an interesting little film. But again, some people have said that it feels almost like a television episode. Some I've even labeled it or connected it to Perry Mason in some ways, or having that sort of feel. And I think when you see this film, if you've ever seen any sort of cop show, legal procedural, lawyer show, whatever, from the 50s or 60s in the black and white television era, you're going to be kind of reminded of that. It does obviously have a bit of a feature gloss, but it is more of a B picture. And it is based on a stage play source, and it doesn't really transcend past those origins for most of its runtime. So you can sort of feel like, oh, this is supposed to be a problem picture about an idea, and not necessarily a film about juvenile delinquency, but there is a sort of a linkage to films of that sort of subgenre. So it is a solid little film, but unfortunately it doesn't quite work, and its lead character is so vehemently disagreeable that by at least 20 minutes in, you can't stand the guy, and it just gets continually worse and worse and worse. And the whole finale and climax, and especially the ending, feels so disjointed and out of place that it does leave a bad taste in the mouth. So again, I think it's an interesting film to study. I think it's a fascinating inclusion here because it's a film I've always wanted to see, and it is important to look at the films that Bogart produced as part of Santana, especially the ones that he wound up not starring in. And when you look at films like The Family Secret, you can identify the elements you think that work and really play around with it in your head to see how you could possibly improve it yourself. And that is a very important idea to keep in mind to understand films better, because quite often you learn so much more by studying films that don't quite work, or have the germ of a good idea, or have a good idea or a plot premise behind them and good things in them, but they don't quite seem to come together. You learn more a lot of times by studying films like this and thinking about them over and over and over than you do about classics. So it's just as important to study films like this as it is to study the classics and interesting other films in this set. So that's why I was so glad it was included here and that I finally got to see it, because again, this film was very obscure and I had meant to get that MOD DVD, but I had just not gotten around to it. So that's why I was so thrilled that Indicator was including it, because it's not been released anywhere else. So this is another title that is exclusive to the Blu-ray format on this set. Now, in terms of the picture quality, it is a Sony HD master. I assume it's the same thing that was on their choice DVD MOD release, because there is no other release of the film that I'm aware of, and it is very obscure. It does have a very healthy looking appearance. I did not notice any major issues of damage or anything going on, so that was a nice thing to see. And of course, since the film had a very limited theatrical run and then went right into obscurity, it would make sense that it was not reissued a million times and run to death and had all kinds of damage to deal with. So it seems very much like a film that was made quickly, put out, and then immediately returned to the vaults and then sat on the shelf for many decades and essentially was completely forgotten. It does look quite nice, but unfortunately the photography is also on the plain sides at times, which I think heightens that sort of connection people have in their heads of thinking it more like a television episode in a lot of ways. So it does have, unfortunately, a bit of a flatter look in some places, but it does have nice visual moments and nice very noir-esque feeling bits of photography and setups and bits of shadow, particularly shadow falling over David's face as he sinks further into his seemingly never-ending disagreeable choices, shall we say. So it does have noir vibes, but it does also quite frequently have more of a flatter sort of television appearance. So again, you can see why, very clearly, why people might make that sort of claim. This feels more like a television episode in some ways of a nice hour-long drama. So I do think the picture is quite solid, but it is obviously not a new scan or full restoration. Now, in terms of the audio, it fares pretty much the same. It is obviously PCM mono. It is from Sony's HD master, and it sounds quite healthy. There are no major issues to report, and again, I would assume that is most likely because this film is very obscure and was not run to death or run really much at all. And hopefully, seemingly, I'm sure the original negative was hopefully stored quite well, since it was not really run or shown. And so the film should be in perfect shape, which is why the video transfer seems to be in perfect shape. And that goes for the audio as well. So it was a nice audio presentation without any major issues to report. And then we come to the packaging, where we have the original US 1 sheet on the front cover. It is a little plain looking, but you do get the sort of bit behind the roadhouse where the actual main event that sets the film in motion takes place. It has wonderful color to the printing, as all of these do, and even if it's a more plain poster like this, I still enjoy having the original poster artwork more than anything, because that's what a video really should have, even on a more obscure title like this, where it's not a super attention-grabbing poster. When you get it lovingly reproduced like this, that is what I really love to see more than anything. We have the same custom spine. Then the rear has the tagline, which tells you, exactly what the film is about in a tagline, and does have some energy to it, which I wish the film had more of that sort of desperation that the tagline suggests. Then we open to find an alternate poster that's a bit more dramatic, with another scene of David trying to have yet another failed conquest and his bad decisions. But it is, again, a bit more of a dramatic poster. And then we have the disc, which goes back to the white label, and then has the image, which is used as the underside of the disc tray. This is one of my favorite bits of the film, where after David has realized he has wronged the only truly other person that cares about him in a terribly selfish and awful way, he presents her with a pair of brass knuckles for when he gets out of hand again, and you frequently wish that she actually used them on him because he's such a terrible person. So we'll leave it at that. Now to talk about the extras, this has some really substantial ones, and you wouldn't think for a really obscure B film that doesn't even star Bogart that it would have special features at all, but this is Indicator we're talking about. So once again, they credit this is a Sony HD remaster with the original mono audio. There is an audio commentary because Indicator commissioned ones for all the films in this set. So Jason Ney does a track for this, and it's funny, he even starts it by saying, "Oh, I was so excited to do a commentary for Indicator doing a Bogart set." And I was like, I wonder what I'll get to do. I'm so excited. And then Indicator messaged him, "Hey, you want to do the you want to do a commentary for the obscure Santana film that Bogart didn't star in?" And then he's like, "Oh." So it's funny and very rewarding that he actually starts the commentary by saying that. And so he does get into a lot of nice production detail. He talks about the various cast and crew members and about their time in Hollywood at that era. It's really lovely for those like myself who are really impressed by Jodie Lawrence's performance in the film. He talks about how her career unfortunately went south very quickly, and that it was really for unfair and stupid reasons, and that she should have had a much greater career. He talks about where Lee J. Cobb was in his career at this point, and of course how he would be affected by the blacklist that was taking further effect at this time, unfortunately. Talks about John Derek some more, and the rest of the cast and crew, and also how the film was brought together in addition to some wonderful historical background information. So it is a very solid track for a very obscure film. So it's rare for films this obscure to get a commentary track that actually, somebody did real research on and put effort into. So it's a real surprise. It does, I think, enhance your opinions of the film once you see it, because it is such an obscure title, and you'll probably see it once and you might not think too much of it, but I do think the commentary will enhance your opinions or views on the film, and perhaps encourage you to see it a second or third time. Then we go on to more of the World War II documentaries. This one included because it was directed by Henry Levin, who directed the film, and this was really done as a sort of follow-up to the more famous The Black Soldier. So this is The Black Sailor. So this is trying to essentially get African American citizens to enlist in the Navy, and it is very much done in the same sort of idea, but it does not have the sort of more artistic high thought put behind it. It is well put together, but it is a bit more comical and basically you have a young man deciding he's going to enlist and going into his office and announcing it, and then you get the whole story about how the recruitment process is and how the indoctrination process is, and we see everybody going through the sort of boot camp and everything. So it is repeating a lot of the things we got in the previous film, but it doesn't have the same incredible historical significance, and it's not trying to go for the greater artistic ideals of at least trying to show elements of a perhaps better society while completely ignoring the fact that the army and navy and everyone was still completely segregated, and the conditions for African American citizens serving in the armed forces during the war were frequently pretty terrible or nowhere near the conditions of everyone else. So there is the unfortunate, much darker side to these particular wartime documentaries, that they had to completely cover all of that up or sidestep it or not mention it entirely and pretend like it didn't exist. So when you're looking at these, this is very clearly patterned after the previous, much more successful, much more important, and much more famous propaganda piece. But it is a fascinating inclusion, and again, very important because it was directed by the same director of the film, Henry Levin, who would go on to a number of interesting films, in particular doing the live-action parts of the classic Cinerama feature, The Wonderful World of the Brothers Grimm. And then we get another older short film. This is entitled The Big Moment from 1954, runs about 26 minutes, and it was produced for the United Jewish Appeal, and one of the stars is John Derek. So this was later in his career when he was about to start transitioning out of acting because he wound up deciding he wanted to do other things, never felt he was really much of an actor to begin with. So this is a film that is essentially trying to be a sort of recruitment drive for the United Jewish Appeal, and also encourage people to donate to their yearly funds. So you do literally have the recruitment drive at the beginning and end, sort of bookending things. But it is trying to give an idea of sort of turning points in time for various characters that are depicted, and sort of how their faith in humanity assists them in making the right decision. So it is very much a, to call it sort of very heavy-handed is quite obvious, but you do have a number of famous faces appear. So we have John Derek, who's in a sequence. It's actually divided into multiple sequences, but the final sequence has John Derek with Donna Reed, and there's also a nice little part for Thomas Mitchell in one of the earlier segments. So these are fascinating artifacts of their time. It's amazing to see that they've even been preserved. These were this and another in this set were actually done as part of the Steven Spielberg Preservation Project. That's what it's credited as when the short starts. But it's fascinating to see these stars and famous faces pop up in these little short films and these, not really promotional pieces, but these particular titles that would not have been seen outside of their intended audience. So it's a fascinating thing to look at, and that it has been actually scanned and preserved, and that it even survived. So there are performances out there of iconic stars that you probably have not seen or even heard of in a lot of little films like this, and it is important to preserve them, to have these various records of specialized groups making their own short films and producing their own short films for very specific intended target audiences. Then we go into the wonderful image gallery, which again is a mixture of wonderful high-res stills with promotional materials, and then some great poster selections as well. Let me close out with the new and improved English subtitles, and the fact that this is the world premiere of this film on Blu-ray. So this is the only way you will get this title in HD anywhere. The only other option is Sony's old MOD DVD from a number of years ago. So again, I do think this film is quite interesting, and I'm so happy that we finally have it on a lovely HD release from Indicator. I think it's fascinating to see one of the only films that Bogart's company produced that he didn't star in, and I do think you can understand why he and the company was attracted to this story. There is great intelligence behind it. It is a sort of a problem picture in that it has a sort of problem that's going to be dealt with. There are elements of it being a social drama and a message picture. So you can understand the intellectual aspects that would have drawn Bogart's company to making this film. I just think, unfortunately, that the actual script doesn't quite live up to the premise, and it really makes the lead character so disagreeable that that the audience will very quickly come to hate the lead character and not care what happens to him. And the real standouts are Lee Jacob and especially Jodie Lawrence, who I think steals every scene she has in the film and makes you wish that the film was actually about her character instead of the very self-centered John Derek character. But it is still an interesting little film. It is very much a B film, but it is a fascinating artifact of this point in time in the studio system and Bogart's production company, who was having to turn out programmers like this to keep the company going, to simply have a cash flow coming in. So, but even then, they weren't just tossing off things. This is still, several cuts above in terms of high concept thought of when compared to other B films that companies were just sort of throwing out there to have fodder and product to feed the sort of grind mill of the bottom half of a double bill for theaters, to have something for exhibitors to be running. So it does have some interesting thoughts to it. It has some nice scenes and some nice characterizations, but I just think it doesn't quite come together. And again, particularly the ending does leave a bad taste in the mouth. And a lot of this is sort of echoed by what you hear in the commentary. So I do think the listening to the commentary track does enhance your opinions on the film. And now we come to the final film in the set, easily the most important, the most impactful, and the one with the longest lasting legacy, because of course it was Bogie's final film. That is 1956's The Harder They Fall, directed by the great Mark Robeson, and the only film in the set to have received a brand new 4K frame-by-frame restoration by Sony Pictures. So this is the one disc in the set that is sourced from a new restoration. And of course, it's also the only film in the set that is actually in widescreen. So this is in the original 1.85 ratio, while the rest are in Academy ratio. The Harder They Fall is it's one of the great boxing films, simply put. It deals with Bogie's character, an aging sports writer who's fallen on harder times and is out of a job, and essentially sells himself for a cause he knows is an unjust one, basically becoming the PR man for a corrupt boxing promoter played by Rod Steiger to promote a boxing find from Argentina, who is completely unaware of how crooked the boxing circuit can be and is not a very good boxer. So it is really a morality tale that really gets into the seedier aspects of the corruption of the boxing industry, and itself is based on several notable real-life events and cases and figures that had taken place in the 1930s and 40s. It was originally written as a novel by Bud Schulberg, writer of On the Waterfront, which should give you an idea to the sort of inherent realism and grittiness that this film has. But he himself was a great boxing fan, and the film does diverge from the novel quite substantially. And the film is from an entirely different perspective, because the character in the novel, the protagonist, is a young man. Here it's rewritten to fit Bogart, but of course he has a whole lifetime's worth of experience behind him, so that sort of changes the paradigm of the story being told, even though the rest is pretty similar. And I think it's a richer story for doing that. But the film, it's no secret, the film is not just one of the great boxing films. It's not just about the inherent problems that existed in boxing, but it's an indictment against boxing itself. It is a scathing indictment against boxing. Mark Robeson had previously made Champion, another of the classic boxing films that made Kirk Douglas a star, and you get the sense that he had sort of, and he's even quoted in interviews as saying something similar, that had he had been given the chance to do it again, he would have never made a picture that sort of, not necessarily glorified boxing, but would have definitely portrayed it as much more of the blood sport that it could be. So in this film, he definitely does that, and no one escapes that sort of that sort of indictment, from the corrupt promoters to the fighters who are torn apart, but especially it's also an indictment of the sort of bloodlust of the crowds themselves. So it's an indictment against the society that would spawn and support such a sport without, not just without regulation, but such a sport in general, and the sheer wear and tear and damage and fatalities that it causes to those who participate in it. And it very obviously, clearly puts the audience's face in and rubs it in, that this is what can occur, and it actually does show real life boxers who had brain damage in a very notable sequence where they actually talk to a real life boxer who had suffered terrible brain damage, and you can very clearly see the after effects. And you think it's a performance at first, and then you discover no, it's not. That was the real person. And again, a lot of the events are based on real life things, and so that adds to the sort of inherent documentary flavor the film has, which is further aided by Robeson really trying to get and maintain a constant stream of real world footage. So it's not just there's quite a lot of practical locations in the film. There's a lot of location work, so it gives you a nice time capsule flavor. But in particular, when you have Bogie and Rod Steiger walking around the actual New York streets in 1955-56 when they shot the film, that definitely gives you a time capsule, you are there flavor. And because as they take the young upstart boxer who is really just completely in over his head and has no idea that every fight he's in is fixed, they go across countries, they build up his name, and rather strikingly, it's done on a big tour bus with a gigantic mock-up of the boxer on the side, and as they go across the country, it becomes more and more gaudy, and it starts to really stick in the Bogart character more and more and more that he's essentially sold himself to do this, and simply because he wants that nicer payday, and he's tired of being ground into the dirt, and he's older, and he doesn't want to admit it to himself, but he knows exactly what he's doing. And that's the central morality play of the story, while also being a scathing indictment against the entire form of boxing itself, which is a real bone of contention that Schulberg had with Robeson and the film, because Schulberg was a boxing fan and was pushing for regulation, but in the novel it is much more, the novel is basically much more about boxing and problems that could be fixed, whereas the film is basically, saying that this is just terrible all around. And the real world flavor that's maintained throughout by the location footage, by the real life practical sets, and also the usage of real terminology in terms of boxing, and having actual boxers not just be in the film as extras, but actually have significant notable parts, actually playing other boxers and opponents and trainers. That adds to the verisimilitude of the piece, but also little bits of business that were known to be part of how fights were fixed. I think most notably is when right before the fight, the opponent decides he doesn't want to throw the fight because he's going to embarrass all of his family and friends and out in the arena. And so the way they convince him to essentially take a dive and not look like he's taking a dive is that they ask him if he knows about chicken wire, and he says no. So they explain that if you take a piece of chicken wire and you put it in the mouth just under the gums, and once you start getting hit a little bit, it cuts into your gums and causes you to bleed profusely, and then they have to call the fight because you're bleeding heavily, and so you seem to already be injured. So that's how they convince him to take a dive without looking as if he's taking a dive, and that is actually something that really did happen. That's just a prime example of a physical item or event that is pulled directly out of the corrupt world of boxing at the time. Now, some have said that the film is maybe a bit too heavy-handed in being against boxing, that these were events and things that happened in the 30s, 40s, and early 50s, and the film is taking place in the mid to late 50s. However, these were things that had not been completely eradicated, and calling for a sort of overseeing organization to have rules and regulations would make sense, and I don't see why that would be a problem, except for those who were exploiting the boxers and making tons of money off of them, even when they died. So the film is very much one that calls all of this into question, but it doesn't try to say that there's an easy answer, but it does come down very strongly against the whole notion of boxing in general, partially, mostly due to the corrupt practices, but also the sheer damage that it does mentally and physically to those who participate and are not taken care of properly, and then just pretty much shown the door and thrown out on the street when they're no longer useful. And then, of course, they're usually either brain damaged or disfigured or handicapped in some fashion, or they're dead. So this does not purport to be a positive look at the world of boxing. And that is driven home most in the actual boxing sequences, which are unbelievably striking. Of course, the film is in widescreen, black and white. It was shot again by Burnett Guffey, who was nominated for an Oscar for photographing this film. And the boxing sequences have such a degree of realism and a kinetic quality because they mix in set footage and trying to fully recreate real-life boxing footage, but also utilize handheld camera work and faster editing. But it definitely puts you right there in the ring with the boxers, to where you feel the sweat coming off their faces, you feel the building intensity, you feel them getting worn down, and you, the audience, are getting worn down. And the soundtrack is also expressly designed to really carry across the punishing nature of the blows, and particularly when we get to the later fights, and it builds suspense when, of course, the final fight will be against the boxer who refuses to not just throw the opening of the fight, but essentially try and murder the boxer, who's not really a boxer but isn't aware of it, in the ring, simply due to some strange, warped sense of pride. But the sequences of the actual matches are, when you see them, they will seem at least slightly familiar, because this film was an enormous influence on Raging Bull. In fact, you can't help but think of Raging Bull when you see this film, particularly the boxing sequences, because it is one of the key influences. People might mention Kubrick and Day of the Fight, and as they should, but this is another of the key ones, and especially because all of the boxing sequences here are about not just the wear and tear put on the boxers and the intensity of what's going on, but also the screaming and roaring and sort of inhuman seeming crowd around them, and those who are secretly in control trying to manipulate everything simply for their own financial gain. So the boxing sequences are truly intensive and are unbelievably striking, and they feel like a completely different era. It does not feel like a 50s film, and it still remains some of the best boxing footage in any film ever. And the film, as I said, is one of the great boxing films. So the actual fight sequences are real standouts. Again, they build such an intensity, and they're uncomfortable because they're supposed to be uncomfortable. You start to get this feeling of malaise because you know things are going to go bad at some point, and then when they go bad, they're going to really go bad, and it really allows that sense of unease to build as we know what happens to these men and how they're just being manipulated and mistreated and essentially ripped off because they're not being properly paid and taken care of by those who claim to be doing so and are merely using them as pawns to further their own financial interests. So really, the film is a battle of wills between the Bogart character and the Steiger character, and that's where we have the film come most to life, where you have these real one-on-one battles between not just men of different generations, but two completely different styles of acting, because of course Steiger was from the method school and gives a extraordinarily intensive performance, almost as if his character of Nick Benko is almost, he gives this quality of having this pent up energy or rage, like he's almost like he's a pit bull or a bulldog who's having to maintain that, and he's trying to keep a civil front, and he's always dressed in a suit. But when the anger starts to boil, or things don't necessarily start going his way, you see that start to seep out, and it's like he's trying to maintain this false front of civility all the time. That's rather striking, but you get that sense of somebody crosses them, they're obviously going to wind up dead, probably with 100 bullet holes in them in the street, in their body, in the street somewhere. And of course he'll get away with it because he's got it properly planned to not be implicated. But it's these one-on-one moments where the two really just dial up the intensity factor to well off the scale, that you can see the most iconic Bogie type moments here. And again, it's the playing into the morality of the story of this character knows what he's getting into, and he knows he's doing something he really shouldn't, and something that goes against his own sort of personal and moral code, and it starts to wear away and eat away at him. But will it be enough for him to reject this and to ostensibly do the right thing before it is past the point of no return? And in the end, what's more important, the big pot of gold in terms of the payoff that he's getting, or his own moral code and his own conscience, let alone protecting the life of this young kid from Argentina who has no clue of anything that's going on? His lack of awareness only helps to further the deep pangs of the submerged conscious of the Bogart character. And it must be said that because this is Bogart's last film, and that it is visible on screen that he was already suffering and in great pain from the cancer that would ultimately kill him, just really only less than a year after the film was released because he died in early 1957. It is a testament to his acting legend, if you will, to his long career, that even when you know that's there and you can see in points that obviously he must have been in terrible pain and agony, it doesn't ever affect the performance. In fact, it seems to heighten the performance because there seems to be an even greater degree of world weariness than what we're used to in the traditional Bogart screen image. So while it does have some flashes and bits of the iconic Bogart we have in our heads, and some of his more classic roles, and in that way, it's sort of really, it's sort of a goodbye, is what it is, because this was the last film, and it's impossible to not think of that. Some have even gone as far as to make a claim that some of his scenes were redubbed by others because his voice was so weak in some points, but that's not really true. What they did have to do, though, sometimes was to do a couple more takes of certain scenes because his eyes were watering so badly. And if you look closely, you can even see a little bit of that here and there. And there are some points where it seems that not necessarily his voice is weaker, but that there's definitely some extra emotion in his voice every once in a while. When you're a Bogart fan and you've read his history and you know this was his last film, it's impossible to not sort of have that preying on your mind a little bit, and it adds such an additional degree of poignancy to this film. And again, it is sort of a final version of the Bogartian screen image or screen hero, the man who lives and dies by his own moral code, whatever the cost may be of doing the right thing, and having that moral center and that moral code, because without that, you're not really anything. So again, it's a sort of goodbye to that. It's the one last time of that, and it's fascinating. And again, it's the one-on-one moments between this sort of final, even more world weary Bogart hero and him going toe to toe with Rod Steiger. It is, I mean, to say it's a masterclass in seeing two magnificent actors go toe to toe with completely different styles is an understatement. Really, these sequences are what the film is all about, and they are the key high points. You could really separate and look at each one of them as individual scenes, and just you can marvel over them. But it's an interesting dance between the two of them because, again, Bogart was not a method actor, didn't really approve not necessarily that he didn't approve of method acting, but it was a newer thing, so he was of an older generation, so there was that sort of divide, and Ron Steiger had that completely different approach, but it does really fit the two characters who are completely opposed to one another. And I think there's an energy in how they play off of each other, because you have Steiger going with all this deep energy behind the sort of facade he's got going on, and especially in his eyes you can see this passionate fervor that he's just barely holding in check. And then he can have these wonderful speeches that spellbind you, and then immediately Bogart has a reaction shot without even a word of dialogue. He just does one of the looks, and it makes everything that Steiger just did just fall flat, and then it continues this sort of back and forth and a little bit of one-upsmanship, and it clearly becomes obvious that it's starting to eat away at the Bogart character. And this gets fully represented in human form because the character's actually married in this film, and his wife is played by Jan Sterling, who unfortunately it's more of a sort of, not necessarily a cliched character, but the sort of wife who is trying to get her husband out of this sort of situation that he himself has put himself in, and she realizes much before he's ready to admit it to himself that this is really a corrupt world, and it's full of darkness, and it's going to only end in bad things for everyone involved, let alone the poor boxer out there having to take all the physical punishment. So it's a really refreshing thing to see her do, because Jan Sterling is pretty much known for doing a lot of classic film noirs and playing much darker characters. I think probably my favorite role of hers, she's in the masterpiece Billy Wilder did, Ace in the Hole, where she is one of the great dark noir femme fatale characters. So seeing her here in this film playing a character that is on the surface maybe a bit more simplistic in terms of, okay, you've seen that type of character before, but actually giving it some humanity and some emotion, and she does have some good chemistry with Bogart. So it's really wonderful and refreshing to see her in a completely different type of role, and technically, I guess you could say more, quote unquote, a sort of normal type role of playing more of a normal person who obviously can see very quickly that her husband is really getting into a mess and associating with people who are not anybody who should be associated with, really. So it's a really nice thing to see her in a completely different type of role here, and it does enhance what would be a more straightforward type of role. I have not read the novel yet, and I really would like to, because it is very different, and apparently the wife character was invented for the film as part of changing the protagonist around to be the older, more wise sports writer. And there is something about that change that I really do sort of prefer, that this is somebody who's not just a young man, as he is apparently in the novel, who's sort of seduced by the wealth and the inherent fame of this world, while knowing it's probably not a good thing. In the film, it's much more of, it's somebody who's been around the block many times and is tired of getting kicked around and decides he wants some of that action for himself. And so he sells a bit of himself without necessarily realizing it, realizing the full extent of how much of himself he has sold and how much of his moral code he has violated by going in with this corruption, simply to make his own share of the pie and get a nice chunk of change at the end of the day. Meanwhile, he's not admitting to himself that he hates himself the whole time doing it, and it's inherent in every single frame of Bogart's performance that this is just eating away at him over and over and over, and it's only growing, and it's an incredibly nuanced performance. So it is befitting that, ultimately, if you have to go out, you want to go out with something that is worthwhile and meaningful and has poignancy and has a lasting impact. And that's why The Harder They Fall is such an important film and such a classic. And it does have that poignancy because it is Bogart's last film. But it is heightened by the key factor of what makes this film great. And that is Mark Robeson, Mark Robeson, Mark Robeson, and Mark Robeson, because he really pushes this film to have a bite to it. Again, this is not just, oh, it's a film about boxing and corruption and stuff. It is a scathing indictment of what boxing had become and the sort of bloodlust that was inherent in people who went to boxing with great fervor, not thinking about the sheer toll and human cost that it had associated with it. So that's why the film goes for a very striking message to close out with, which again was something that Bud Schulberg, the original writer, strongly disagreed with. So this is an example where the film adaptation not only changes things in the book to get past the production code, but also to befit having Bogart as the lead and reworking it a little bit here and there. But you have a director who is firmly against boxing as a sport and what it does to people. And so that changes the tone of the film. This factor, coupled with the desire to have a sort of realism by using a lot of real-world locations, a lot of real-world settings as sets for sequences, by getting footage of the bus actually driving around the country and getting that footage of them walking around in New York and Times Square in the 1950s. And it really makes it feel as if it is something that is taking place right then and there, and you are merely an onlooker. It has a real intensity to it that you just didn't get in boxing films. Boxing films were, up to that point, much more about other characters or about the sort of whirlwind lives of boxers. Even the great films like Kid Galahad or Gentleman Jim were about the sort of experience of that sort of whirlwind of the constant ups and downs of being a boxer, or the sort of the gangster circles that surrounded the world of boxing. So this film really tries to focus on the human cost of all of this and what it does to everyone involved. And it has the tenacity to have that punch to it and to come up with a possible solution, but the ending itself is not resolved. It leaves that sort of lingering thought in the head that this is a problem, however you choose to look at it. It's something that cannot continue in this way, shape, or form, and something must be done, but what that may be is going to be up to society and the government at large. So in that sense, it could be considered slightly like what would used to be termed a message picture in the classic Hollywood studio days of this is a film with a definite message, and it does not pull its punches, no pun intended. And that is, I think, entirely due to Mark Robeson directing this film, who at this time was really trying to do more, make films with more of a social conscience. This was something that both he and Robert Wise wanted to do, and they had been longtime friends and associates because of their time in the Val Lewton unit at RKO, and it was actually Lewton who elevated both of them to becoming directors, and they both worked on some of the legendary horror masterpieces that the unit created. Both started out in editing and worked on Mercury Productions, including working on Citizen Kane and Magnificent Ambersons in different capacities. And so they had that shared background. They were friends, and they had that same sort of idealism in terms of what you could do with trying to tell great stories about real people and real things and make movies that mattered, essentially, which is something they definitely shared with Lewton, who was essentially a sort of godfather to their careers, essentially. And it's just sort of a shame that both of them kind of got not indoctrinated, but sort of swallowed up into bigger Hollywood films once the studio system started to erode in the 60s and 70s. But they still would make films that had great core ideas and themes in them, but they're not often looked at for that. They're looked at as being sort of, I think most people would look at Robeson as a journeyman director, and Robert Wise as being a journeyman director who also made some of the big iconic classics that people remember. But if you look at their films closely, even later on, they were always about a really interesting core philosophical idea or a real social problem. And it seems when you look at their filmographies, Robeson had more of an attack on material that was a bit more obvious than what Wise would do. And most interesting is if you look at the film Robert Wise made around the same time as The Harder They Fall, a boxing picture called Somebody Up There Likes Me, which was a big sort of launching pad for Paul Newman. It is a great boxing film, but while it does go into some similar themes as The Harder They Fall, it does not have the intensity or the bite or the punch to it that The Harder They Fall does. And actually, revisiting this film makes me want to go look at the other film quite a lot, because I hadn't realized that they were pretty much made almost head to head right around the same time period. But it's a really striking thing, I think, to look at the difference between Robeson and Wise, since they had such a similar viewpoint and had the shared background. If I haven't seen every film Robeson directed yet, but I do hope to at some point. But for me, I think this is probably the best film he made after leaving the Luton unit. It is an incredible experience. It's extraordinarily powerful, and again, a scathing indictment of what the boxing industry had become and how Robeson really thought that, he really thought it was beyond salvageable. And he does make his point very eloquently in the film. Not everyone may agree with that, but you can't disagree with the sheer intensity and passion of what is displayed, and especially when the film is dealing with real events and real people, playing sort of rewritten versions of themselves and sort of replaying events that they actually participated in. And most especially when you have actual boxers in the film with severe brain damage, being really unable to properly articulate whatsoever. It's just it's a searing, scathing indictment of the world of boxing. It remains one of the great boxing films with some of the best boxing sequences you'll ever see. Again, it's an enormous influence on Raging Bull, whether that's in print or not. As soon as you see this film, it's immediate. And because the core novel was written by Bud Schulberg, it has some of that on the waterfront flavor of being a very gritty story about real people, about people with definite emotions and real world problems and complications that arise. But all of this is topped off by the just incredible, unbelievable Bogart lead performance. And it is a phenomenal performance, made all the more impressive when you understand just how much of an incredible struggle it was for him to actually finish the film and to not have the extreme pain that he was already experiencing really show. And not everyone was aware of this. Steiger later said that he only really found out later, and then realized like an idiot that's why they had to repeat takes sometimes, and Bogart didn't make a big thing out of it, and not Steiger not knowing or not realizing that it was all because of the just extreme pain that he was going through, and still giving a world-class, iconic performance. It is one of his best screen performances. It's so deeply nuanced. And while there was talk about other projects he was supposed to do and things that were already going ahead at studios and things he was supposed to do, I think I think there was a sort of innate sense, at least at some point during the production, probably at least once it got underway, that when things continually kept getting worse, I think he probably at least had some sort of sense, whether he put it into words or not, that this probably would be the last one, because of course he was diagnosed with esophageal cancer and again died less than a year after the film was released. So that's why the film has such a status to it and such a such it has it is iconic. I think it is one of the great boxing films for sure. It is so impressively directed by Mark Robeson, who really is the driving force behind everything. And I think had anybody else directed it and not had that same sort of fervor for this picture has to mean something, we wouldn't be talking about it in the same fashion. It would be remembered for other things. But what most people may know of it now is that it was Bogart's last film and that he was already suffering from cancer and in terrible pain during the making of the film. But it is a testament to his craft that it doesn't really show. And unless you're sitting there and you're a fan and you've seen the film before and you can sort of look closely at things, you sort of think you might maybe see a little wince here and there. But he's obviously not a well man. And if you look at all the films in this set, because they take place over a span of certain years, you will see him. You know, the Bogart of The Harder They Fall is obviously not the Bogart of Dead Reckoning, which was, you know, less than 10 years before, really, when you look at the production dates. So you will see him progressively change over the span of the 6 films. But it really adds such a poignancy to the film overall and the performance when you know the background of where Bogart was at this time, and that you really see him suffering from the disease that would ultimately kill him shortly thereafter. And it's you just get this sense of his trying to invest the performance with everything he had, and he really does. I do think it is one of his best screen performances, and it is a sort of final goodbye to his, you know, sort of screen image of the Bogartian hero with the deeply set moral code. So you can see shades of Sam Spade, shades of Rick Blaine, shades of Philip Marlowe, and even some shades of Dixon Steele or Fred Dobbs or Charlie Allnut. You know, they're all sort of there in varying fashions, which is again why this is such a poignant performance, and it's such a again, if you had to go out with the film, you want it to be a great film and a great performance, and this is one of those cases where somebody really went out giving it, you know, everything they had. And especially when you know how difficult it was and what he was suffering, it only enhances your appreciation for the performance in the film all the more. So that's why it makes sense that this was the film that Sony has restored in 4K. It is one of the gems in their library. It is unquestionably the best and most important film in this set, and it is the sort of cornerstone of the films that Bogart wound up making at Columbia, whether for the studio or for his Santana Corporation. And they were all films that tried to break beyond the sort of Warner mold he had been in at Warner Brothers, of sort of trying to be a bit grittier, a bit more realistic, try some different things. Not all of them necessarily worked, but they were a bit more experimental. They were done in a different style. Columbia did not have, obviously, as much money or resources as Warner Brothers, so they might seem a little cheaper on the surface, but they were allowed to do different things because it was a different studio, and Bogart had producing clout. So this film, I think, crystallizes all of that, and I think it is the perfect final film for this set, and still one of the great boxing films ever. Just and a must for all Bogart fans. It's again that final sort of goodbye, that swan song final role that somebody gets, and especially when they know they don't have much time left and they just give it everything. And if you ever needed an example of why Humphrey Bogart was such an incredible actor and could do so much with just the slightest movement or just a single glance of his eyes, just a single reaction without any dialogue. You could choose any scene, sequence, shot from this film, and you have your answer right there. So The Harder They Fall still remains incredibly powerful, due both to the poignancy of Bogart's performance and the tenacity of Mark Robson's direction, and it is one of the great boxing films, period, end of story. So that is why it is such a wonderful thing to have it on this wonderful Blu-ray release from Indicator, from the brand new 4K restoration that Sony Pictures has just completed. So now to talk about the picture quality, because this is the only film in the set that is in widescreen, 1.85:1, and is the only film in the set to be from a brand new Sony Pictures 4K restoration. Obviously, this is the visual standout and highlight of the set in terms of AV quality. The film looks stunning. Again, Burnett Guffey's photography is really beautifully expressive, and having it in this new 4K restoration really shows off the detail in the, especially in all the location photography. Again, you get that wonderful 50s time capsule sense, especially and most of all when they're going through Times Square in 1956. It's just an incredible thing to see. And again, because it's a brand new 4K restoration, there are no major issues to report, no signs of damage or anything. It looks absolutely spotless, and I think the only improvement you can make over this wonderfully mastered Blu-ray, because it is a 4K restoration, this obviously means that it could be released on UHD at some point, which Sony does do with their classic Columbia catalog titles. So they're about to come out with their Columbia Classics UHD Volume 3, so it's very possible they could eventually do this film as a UHD release themselves on like a later volume, or as a standalone, as I've done with some titles that were first done as Blu-ray by a boutique label. So I don't know if that will happen, but I think that would be the only way you could possibly improve on this slightly, because this is a stunning looking disc, and easily the best I've ever seen the film, which I've only ever seen it on the older video releases. And the last one was the old early 2000s DVD, which doesn't hold a candle to this visually. That will definitely show you the difference between a well-made, but I think it was like 2003 or 2004 or something when it came out, an old early 2000s DVD release of a black and white title, compared to a brand new 4K restoration on a well-mastered Blu-ray release. In terms of the audio, it's once again lossless PCM mono, also from the same 4K restoration, and it sounds excellent. The only thing I noticed, there's a fleeting, very tiny bit of distortion in one of the music cues very early in the film, at about 4 minutes in, but I think that was inherent to the source, because I think that might have been on the old DVD, but that was the only thing I noticed in either picture or sound on this release. It is a beautiful, as pretty much always, Sony 4K restoration of a classic catalog title, and when you're doing a black and white classic, I think it shows off the technical superiority of what modern restorations can do, because it really breathes new life into black and white titles, I think, much more obviously than it does into color titles a lot of times. So that argument of, oh, black and white films aren't as important, well, have you ever seen a 4K scan of a black and white classic and totally had your mind blown? Because that would totally defeat that argument. Now, to talk about the packaging, we have the extraordinarily bold original US one-sheet image from the original poster, printed beautifully on here. And this poster tells you exactly what this film is like. I mean, it's such a bold, striking visual image that you don't need anything else as the cover. I wish the old DVD had stuck with the poster as well. However, they did use the iconic still of Bogart as the DVD cover, which Indicator uses here on the interior. So we have one of the alternate U.S. posters, which is nowhere near as visually striking, I think, with the ultra iconic production still of Bogart in the boxing club at the start of the film. This shot still remains, I think, one of the best stills of Bogart, and a sort of iconic pose, but for those who haven't seen the film, you just get that incredible sense of world weariness that his performance carries in this film. And we have the spine with spine numbering, and then the rear with the extras listing and the original tagline beautifully rendered over the top. So now to talk about the rather stuffed supplemental features section, again credited as Sony's 4K restoration with the original mono audio. The new audio commentary is with both Glenn Kenny and Farron Smith-Neme. They have a nice sort of... It's one of those tracks where, because you have two people, it's much more of a conversational tone, and like you would have if they were doing a filmed interview talking about the film. And so they do get onto other topics as well, but it's still a solid, nice commentary listen. But it is, they do sort of talk about other films and Bogart and his career. They talk a bit about Mark Robeson, and I think the best parts are where they talk about Bogart, Robeson, and also the differences with the novel written by Schulberg and his sort of stance against what the way the film went. So that's the most rewarding part of the commentary track. But it is... You do have two people talking, so they're basically just having a dialogue while the film is going. So it is one of those more conversational style commentary tracks. Then continuing, we have a brand new 11-minute featurette entitled "The Final Bout," where Christina Newland talks about the making of the film and basically talking about more of the differences, comparing it to the original novel. Then we have another Bertrand Tavernier interview piece where he's talking about The Harder They Fall. Again, from an older, presumably French release. It runs 30 minutes, and it has been subtitled by Indicator. And he has some really interesting and great thoughts on the film, on the screenwriter Philip Jordan, who was credited with this film, but he also put his name on the work of blacklisted writers, so there is a great deal of scrutiny about what exactly he may or may not have actually written. But he talks about the whole film in a nutshell, and especially about Mark Robeson being underappreciated, and why this was so important, being Bogart's last film. And also he talks about sort of the sort of Bogart mystique and how he was perceived in France, and how this film was viewed as a very important film in France when it was released, and how essentially how French film culture sort of appreciates this film on a very serious level. So that was a really nice different viewpoint. And again, he speaks at quite a length, because it is half an hour long, and again, that was subtitled by Indicator for those of us who are not fluent in French. So that's very much appreciated. Then next, very fascinatingly, it has two Super 8 films of the fighter Max Baer and some of his boxing matches. Baer appears in the film as one of the fictional boxers. So this is actual vintage footage on transferred from a Super 8 source of some of his fights. So you get an example, at least depicted, of how these fights were done and what they really look like. And then you can compare that to the film version. Then next, the World War II documentary that's included is entitled That Justice Be Done from 1945. It runs about 11 minutes, and it's a short film directed by George Stevens about the Nuremberg trials, and which was actually produced by the Office of War Information and written by Bud Schulberg, who of course wrote the original novel, The Harder They Fall. As I've said with the other titles in this set, it is a really fascinating historical aspect to what Indicator does, of finding works that the various cast and crew members may have done during the war, and finding a way to work it into these releases. So it's a very important historical artifact, and it is fascinating to look at. And of course, it was directed by George Stevens, so that only increases the historical importance factor. And then we move on to, once again, a really phenomenal image gallery that has beautiful, high-quality stills, and then gets into publicity materials, and then a lot of the original poster campaigns, including the wonderful U.S. art, but then also some really striking foreign posters. So once again, Indicator really outdoes themselves even in the image gallery. Then once again, we close out by saying that Indicator has done new and improved English subtitles for the deaf and hard of hearing, and that this is the UK premiere of the film on Blu-ray. You can find the film on Blu-ray in some other releases. There is no US release as of yet, and you do want to see this film in its new 4K restoration, which is really stunning. So this is still, I think, the best way to get the film on disc is as part of this set. And if you were perhaps on the fence about it having more obscure Bogart titles, let's just put it this way. The entire purchase cost of the set is worth it for The Harder They Fall alone. It is a true classic, and any Bogart fan must see this film at least several times because it is so unbelievably poignant and a really biting and dramatic and intensive film experience still. So that is why it is the centerpiece of Indicator's fifth Columbia Noir volume, dedicated entirely to the legendary Humphrey Bogart. Now we move on to what's termed the booklet, but as usual for their limited editions, Indicator makes true books that could be sold as standalones. They are that impressive, and this is no exception. So here is the book that is well over 100 pages long with wraparound art from the set of Knock on Any Door, and as always loaded with beautifully produced original stills at full high-level quality and done in such a way that the book is beautifully put together and will last a very long time. Indicator once again has put together a wonderful package of brand new essays and printed materials by some really great critics, but also fills it with all the historical background information and vintage pieces they can find. Especially most revealing are the interviews they try and locate with various cast and crew members. So there's always quite a degree of historical background to their printed materials, and it's not just a brand new essay with a particular take on said film. So each film gets its own section, as all of these sets have done, but this is just really no one does books like this. I mean, it's a commitment to the level of quality that the label really strives for. But you can really just get that sense. It just leaps off the page when you read one of these, because, again, nobody puts together books as lovingly produced as these. And then here's the section for The Harder They Fall. It's perfect to read this after you've watched all the films in the set because it does give you greater context in addition to the already wonderful extras. And it's just a wonderful piece because it also not only talks about the films, but it also talks about all of the vintage propaganda films, World War II films, and other shorts that they included, and the importance and historical context they have. So that's something that you don't see in terms of most labels putting that additional effort in. That's furthered, I think, when you look at the presentations page and the thanks, because you see not only are the films talked about and that The Harder They Fall was a 4K restoration, but it clearly mentions that the vintage shorts were done from brand new transfers were available and or sourced from restorations. So they didn't just use whatever was floating around. They actually commissioned brand new transfers for these vintage historical artifacts. And again, it's just a part of their commitment to quality that makes them my absolute favorite boutique label. And then closing out with this beautiful publicity shot of Bogart from The Harder They Fall. Now to talk about the box itself, it's done in the same style to match the previous 4 volumes and in the traditional sort of, I still don't know what you call this, but it's the harder case that Indicator uses for all their box sets, which still is beautiful to display but still fits wonderfully on a normal shelf. I really am always impressed by these, and then you get the extensive extras listed on the back along with the films and their runtimes in a nice readable font. All of the spines show out beautifully so you can see the titles really well, and then of course they all have their spine numbers for those who are big on their spines, which also get maintained on the actual printed spine of the box. And everything fits perfectly snug in there, and these things are still. I really love what they do with these boxes. I think the design is brilliant and perfect, and also practical. So the discs are perfectly protected. It still fits on the shelf, but it's still also a beautiful display piece. And another nice touch they always do: the titles are also on the top of the box. So that's another nice little indicator touch. Each of these boxes have a singular image, so here is a still of Bogie, and then that goes along with the sort of box band that comes with these. So this, of course, slips over, and then you can sort of center it or lower it wherever you like, but this is how they're usually displayed. And of course, the band serves to hold all of the discs and inside the box so they don't go flying out when you pick it up. So this has the title of the box plus all the film titles along the spine as well. This is where you have the photographs of the covers and the limited edition numbering. So this is 927 out of 6,000. This is such a work of beauty. All the indicator sets are amazing. So if you're at all interested in this, I do highly recommend to purchase a copy before they're sold out. They will do standard editions eventually of all of these titles, but these are so impressive, and it's part of their Columbia Noir series, which is already essential, that I think this is a really important purchase. And also because it's Bogie, it has much more in terms of there's a bigger fan base, so it is very likely that this will sell out much more quickly than some of the previous volumes. And then they always find a vintage tagline or something to put on the other side. So here is the other side of the band. So that's my review of the 5th and Indicators Columbia Noir series of box sets, this one devoted entirely to the Columbia films of Humphrey Bogart. I think it is another absolute standout release from the label. It has their attention to detail and quality all throughout it. It is loaded with incredible supplemental features that really enhance your viewing for these films, that especially for the ones that rarely get discussed and the ones that don't have such a great reputation, but then also going the extra mile to include the Santana production of The Family Secret that does not star Bogart and is a very obscure film. And if that wasn't enough, the addition of the vintage short films and documentaries and World War II propaganda pieces from brand new scans and restorations as part of the supplemental features is really something that's more along the lines of a historian stream or an archivist stream, because that's the type of stuff that you don't often see covered outside of historian realms or the realms of the archivaldom, if you will. So it's just another sign of their commitment to covering these films as best as humanly possible in the confines of a Blu-ray disc. And it's part of the reason why I love these box sets so much, because you get so much more of the historical context of the time in which these films were made. So it's about the world slightly outside of the innate production of the day-to-day of the making the film. But all this is crowned off by having Sony's brand new beautiful 4K restoration of The Harder They Fall, and having such an incredible box set package with the incredible limited edition book that again is well over 100 pages. So this is without question the single most extensive and best box set that Bogart's films have ever received, far outdoing what the handful of DVD box sets that Warner Brothers has done of some of his more famous titles. Those merely gathered together DVD releases. There were 2 signature collection volumes, and there was an essential collection that gathered together a good number of his Warner Brothers films, but not all of them. And in terms of the extras, they were rather limited to being just DVD extras only on the most famous titles. And none of those approached the level of quality and information found in the extras on just one of the discs in this indicator set. So it's rather striking that even though these are some of his more obscure, lesser known, much lesser discussed, and much less loved films from Columbia outside of The Harder They Fall, which is easily the most well-known of these, it didn't stop Indicator from making yet another excellent must-own release that gave these films the quality and care they deserved. And so hopefully this will help these films be rediscovered or discovered by new audiences who had not seen them before, because there is great richness, I think, in all of them, and so much that is you can learn, which is part of why I love these indicator box sets so much, because even on the more obscure films or the films that aren't quite as good or the films that don't quite work, they're still given a chance to shine, and you're given the ability to view them for yourself with greater context and study them more and understand how they work or maybe don't work, and understand the historical context of the world they were made in and how they were made. So it allows them to essentially breathe quite a bit on their own. And I really do think this is, I mean, it's unquestionably the best Bogart box set in all of home video that has ever existed on any format. There was some Laserdisc collections like I have behind me that again were merely gathering together films. It was a box set collection of separate films with no real extras. Most of the DVD sets from Warner Brothers were like that, with only the most famous titles carrying over the extras they had generated for more special edition DVDs. And obviously Casablanca has a ton of releases with a good number of legacy extras, but outside of that, there are no great Bogart box sets. They are just collections. So now there finally is a great Bogart box set, and ironically, it's for a lot of the films that have been so overlooked for so long. And again, I truly hope this will cause these films to be rediscovered or discovered by new audiences, and especially in conjunction with the wonderful extras, I really hope it helps their reputation, because some of them are far better than what their reputation would suggest, and they're all fascinating. And it's capped off by having the beautiful new restoration of the essential classic film, and Bogart's final, extremely poignant film, The Harder They Fall. So that is my review of Indicator's essential box set, Columbia Noir Volume 5, Humphrey Bogart, the best set that has ever been devoted entirely to the films of Bogart, the must-own release for all Bogart fans, and I think easily the best box set of the year. I know the year's not over, but nothing comes close, I think. At least for me personally. I am biased. I am an extreme Bogart fan, have been my whole life, and so that's why this was such a special and important announcement for me, and I couldn't wait to dig into all of the extras and revisit some of these films, and especially seeing them in HD and seeing them on Blu-ray and seeing The Family Secret for the first time, which I'd only read about before, and seeing the new restoration of The Harder They Fall, and just falling in love with the experience of seeing the later Columbia films that Bogart made all over again, because they do have a particular distinct flavor to them that is different from the classic Warner Brothers films, and one that is also different from the other sort of late period career films he was making, that some may have a bit of that sort of different feeling, but the Columbia films have a sort of unique quality exclusive to them, probably because, of course, they were made at Columbia as opposed to Paramount or other studios besides Warner Brothers. So again, I think for me, this is the box set of the year. This is the one for everyone to beat, and I cannot encourage people strongly enough to purchase a copy from Powerhouse Indicator's website before they sell out, because this set will sell out at some point, and especially because it is a Bogart set, I think it will sell out much more quickly than previous volumes of the excellent Columbia Noir series. However, again, if you do miss the box set, they will be done as standard editions later on down the line, and with it being a restoration of The Harder They Fall, I would presume somebody will probably do a release over here in the US, probably Criterion, because they do have quite good relations with Sony, and they've done a lot of their 4K restorations. So my guess is probably Criterion will do a release of The Harder They Fall on Blu-ray, possibly a UHD as well, since they're now finally doing 4K discs, but my guess is they will probably be the ones to release the restoration of that film here in the US. So don't let the fact that that might happen and the fact that these discs are locked to Region B discourage you from this set. It is so wonderfully produced and so incredibly stuffed with truly important extras that this is the particular type of release you buy a region-free player for, or you find a way to be able to play Region B discs. It is that good. It is that essential. It is produced with a historical and archival mindset. This is a set you'll be able to pull off your shelf and return to for the rest of your home video days, because it is already produced to the best possible quality it can be. It's another standout release from Indicator. It's part of their must-own excellent Columbia Noir series, And it is the best Humphrey Bogart set that has ever existed on home video, and really the only one that pays the proper tribute to the man's iconic legacy and the legacy of his filmography that he left behind. Again, some of the Warner special editions have been very good on DVD, but they always leave you wanting. They never cover everything they should, and so we finally do have that treatment for some of the lesser known and lesser regarded films and the true classic of The Harder They Fall. So I hope this has been informative. I hope I have convinced you that the strengths of this set are incredible. Once again, my hat goes off to Indicator. This is why they're my favorite label in the world. Nobody else puts this level of quality commitment into every release, not just the box sets. They do the absolute best they can with every release, but this one has been really special to me because I am such a Bogart fan, and I have been ever since I was a little kid, and just read every book and every biography and tried to see every Bogie film that ever existed. And he is one of my favorite actors and one of my lifelong, sort of heroic figures. I'm not afraid to admit. So it's definitely the most special release for me, and I do think this is the box set of the year. I really do. So the year's not over yet, but nothing I think is going to challenge this. Although Indicator is working on some other really impressive looking box sets for the rest of this calendar year, but this is such an incredible experience, and I truly hope all Bogart fans rush out and purchase a copy and support this incredible work that the Powerhouse Indicator label continues to do for not just home video and people who love physical media and people who collect Blu-rays, but also for cinematic culture, because in making such excellent packages and committing themselves to such quality, even on films that haven't been restored and they're having to use older masters, they go the extra mile in the extras and the supplemental features and the essays and the booklets and the disc encoding to really make these more of archival releases for future generations to further enjoy and be able to appreciate films that are frequently underrepresented or not spoken about in the way that they should be and that are not truly appreciated. So that is the greatest legacy of these being so well produced, is that they have that sort of archival feel. They feel like a reference volume to be taken out time and time again, and for further generations to be able to do the same thing. So it's just an incredible box set, not just in the realms of physical media and Blu-rays, but in terms of being about preservation of films and being about the preservation of cinematic and film culture. So that's why I love the Indicator label so much, and that's why I try to support the incredible work they do whenever possible. So that is my review of Columbia Noir 5, the Humphrey Bogart set. I think the best set of the year, and I hope this has been at least somewhat fun and informative to hear me babble on about classic films. And as always, thank you ever so much for watching.